The most explosive question in the Rosenberg case is not whether Soviet atomic espionage existed, but whether the courtroom story that sent both Julius and Ethel Rosenberg to the electric chair proved what it claimed. That is the contradiction at the center of the case. Later evidence strongly supports that Julius Rosenberg was involved in espionage for the Soviet Union. National Security Agency materials from the VENONA decrypts identified Julius with Soviet code names including Liberal and Antenna. Those materials were not shown to the jury that convicted him. They were secret, part of a hidden intelligence world that would not begin to enter public view until decades later, with the first public release of translated VENONA messages in July of 1995. But Ethel Rosenberg's precise role remains more contested. The dramatic courtroom claim that she typed atomic notes for transmission to the Soviets was later undermined by released grand jury testimony and by reporting from the National Security Archive. David Greenglass, her own brother and a key witness against her, later publicly admitted that he had lied about some testimony connected to Ethel's alleged typing role. So the question is not simple innocence against simple guilt. It is more difficult than that. It is whether an espionage case, unfolding in an atmosphere of nuclear fear and government secrecy, became something larger than the evidence in open court could safely hold. The final setting was Sing Sing Prison in Ossining, New York. On June 19, 1953, Julius Rosenberg and Ethel Greenglass Rosenberg were executed by electric chair. By then, their names had moved far beyond the U.S. District Court for the Southern District of New York, where they had been tried. They had become symbols. To some Americans, they represented domestic communist betrayal at the most dangerous moment of the early Cold War. To others, they represented a government willing to stretch a prosecution and then impose death in a climate of panic. That night in Ossining did not end the case. It fixed it in American memory. Sing Sing was not where the story began, but it is where the contradictions become hardest to avoid. The prison stood at the end of a chain that had run through secret laboratories, courier meetings, federal interrogations, courtroom testimony, clemency petitions, the Supreme Court, and the White House. The chain passed through names that would become central to Cold War counterintelligence: Klaus Fuchs, Harry Gold, David Greenglass, Julius Rosenberg, Ethel Rosenberg, and Morton Sobell. The official charge was conspiracy to commit espionage, not treason. That distinction matters. Treason is a separate constitutional crime with its own legal burden and its own history. The Rosenbergs were convicted of conspiracy, a crime built not only around a single completed act, but around alleged agreements, connections, meetings, and shared purpose. In a conspiracy case, the architecture of the story matters intensely. Who met whom? Who carried what? Who introduced whom? Who knew what? Who intended what? And in the Rosenberg case, the architecture reached into the atomic age. The United States had built the first atomic weapons under the Manhattan Project, including work at Los Alamos, New Mexico, the secret wartime site associated with Project Y. There, scientists and technicians worked on weapons whose details were among the most guarded military secrets in the world. The first nuclear device assembled and tested by the Manhattan Project was known as the Gadget. Its success marked a new kind of power and a new kind of fear. For a short time, the United States held an atomic monopoly. Then, in 1949, the Soviet Union detonated its first atomic bomb. The shock was not just strategic, it was psychological. If the Soviet Union had built the bomb sooner than expected, many Americans wanted to know how. The Department of Energy's Manhattan Project history later stated that Soviet espionage probably hastened the Soviet atomic bomb by approximately 12 to 18 months. In the climate of the early Cold War, that possibility transformed espionage from a hidden intelligence problem into a national trauma. By the time the Rosenbergs faced trial, the Korean War was also underway. Judge Irving R. Kaufman would later refer to the broader Cold War atmosphere, including Korea, as part of his sentencing rationale. That is one reason the punishment in this case became so divisive. The court was judging a conspiracy to commit espionage. But the language around the case suggested something even larger, that stolen secrets had helped change the balance of world power and perhaps contributed to bloodshed that followed. The prosecution's story was built through a sequence that federal investigators traced from Britain to New York, and from Los Alamos to Manhattan. Klaus Fuchs, a German-born physicist, was arrested in Britain in 1950 and convicted under the British Official Secrets Act. His case helped lead investigators toward Harry Gold, a courier in the atomic espionage investigation. Gold's trail helped connect the investigation to David Greenglass, Ethel Rosenberg's brother, who had worked as a machinist at Los Alamos during the Manhattan Project. At trial, David Greenglass testified that he gave Julius Rosenberg a sketch and descriptive material related to an atomic bomb. One of the key objects in the case became Government Exhibit 8, identified by the FBI as Greenglass's trial sketch of a cross-section of an atom bomb. Another, stranger object became famous for a different reason, a Jell-O box used in the prosecution's account as a recognition device. Preserved in National Archives records as a trial exhibit from March 6th to March 29th, 1951, the Jell-O box gave the jury something tactile. In a case about invisible secrets, encrypted communications, and nuclear design, it offered a cheap grocery package that could be held up in court as spycraft. That is part of what made the Rosenberg trial so powerful. It translated abstraction into objects: a sketch, a box, a courier, a family member, a set of alleged meetings, a network. Julius Rosenberg, Ethel Rosenberg, and Morton Sobell were tried together in Manhattan before Judge Kaufman. The trial took place from March 6th to March 29th, 1951. Prosecutors associated with the case included Roy Cohn and Irving Sapol. Emanuel H. Bloch represented the Rosenbergs. On April 5, 1951, Judge Kaufman sentenced Julius and Ethel Rosenberg to death. From there, the case moved into a long, final struggle. Appeals and petitions reached the Supreme Court, including late-stage litigation in June of 1953 tied to Rosenberg v. United States, 346 U.S. 273. Clemency efforts reached President Dwight D. Eisenhower, who declined clemency in June of 1953. Outside the legal record, the case spread through newspapers, churches, protest committees, and international opinion. The Rosenbergs were no longer only defendants, they were arguments. And yet the archives would not stand still. For decades, the public did not have access to all of the records that now shape how historians understand the case. VENONA materials, associated with National Security Agency history, began as an Army Signal Intelligence Service effort in February of 1943 to examine Soviet diplomatic communications. They were not part of the public courtroom drama in 1951. Grand jury materials remained sealed for many years. The National Archives began releasing formerly secret Rosenberg grand jury transcripts in 2008, including testimony from Ethel Rosenberg, Ruth Greenglass, Harry Gold, and others. Those later records did not erase the evidence against Julius. They sharpened it, but they complicated the story of Ethel. They exposed a gap between the certainty of the execution chamber and the uncertainty that still surrounds parts of the case against her. That is why June 19, 1953 has never fully ended. The electric chair closed 2 lives. It did not close the historical argument. The Rosenberg case remains one of the clearest examples of secret America, a place where intelligence files, sealed testimony, nuclear panic, ideology, and law all meet, and where the public story changes as the archives open. To understand how a New York couple became the center of that collision, we have to leave Sing Sing and move backward into the lives of Julius Rosenberg and Ethel Greenglass Rosenberg before their names became inseparable from espionage, secrecy, and death. To move backward from Sing Sing is not to move away from the Cold War. It is to find the Cold War before it had fully hardened into a national language of fear, inside apartments, political meetings, family loyalties, and ordinary New York lives that would later be read as evidence. Julius Rosenberg was born in New York on May 12, 1918. Ethel Greenglass Rosenberg was born in New York City on September 28, 1915. Before their names became fixed to words like espionage, conspiracy, and execution, they were part of a city where immigrant, working-class politics, union activism, left-wing organizing, and wartime patriotism often overlapped in ways that would later become dangerous to explain. This is one of the reasons the Rosenberg case still resists a simple telling. It was not only a spy case. It was also a New York family case. Ethel was born a Greenglass, and her brother, David Greenglass, would become one of the most important witnesses in the prosecution's story. David worked as a machinist at Los Alamos, New Mexico, during the Manhattan Project. That fact would later connect a family relationship in New York to the most guarded military scientific project in the United States. The distance between those two worlds was enormous. On one side stood the federal government, the FBI, the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Southern District of New York, and the secret architecture of nuclear weapons research. On the other stood a married couple, their relatives, their associations, and the intimate geography of trust and accusation. The case became explosive because it joined those worlds together. By the time Julius and Ethel Rosenberg were tried in Manhattan, the United States was no longer living in the brief period of atomic exclusivity that followed the Second World War. The Soviet Union had detonated its first atomic bomb in 1949. The event changed the meaning of every allegation about atomic information. What might once have sounded like a secret passed in wartime now appeared, to many officials, as part of a larger disaster, the loss of America's short-lived atomic monopoly. That phrase, atomic monopoly, can sound abstract, but in the years immediately after Hiroshima and Nagasaki, it was one of the central facts of global power. The United States had built and used the first atomic weapons. For a short time, it alone possessed them. When that monopoly ended, fear needed an explanation. Soviet science was one explanation. Soviet espionage was another. The Rosenberg case grew inside that second explanation, where domestic communist subversion and nuclear secrecy became part of the same national alarm. The government's investigative account would eventually trace a chain from Klaus Fuchs to Harry Gold to David Greenglass, and then to Julius and Ethel Rosenberg. Fuchs, a German-born physicist, was arrested in Britain in 1950 and convicted under the British Official Secrets Act. Harry Gold was identified as a courier in the atomic espionage investigation. His trail helped lead investigators toward David Greenglass. From there, the case entered the Rosenberg family. This chain mattered because it gave prosecutors a structure. It did not present espionage as a vague atmosphere of suspicion. It presented it as a network, a physicist, a courier, a machinist, relatives, meetings, information, and intent. Later chapters will follow that investigative path more closely. But here, the important point is what happened when the trail reached Julius and Ethel. A case about Soviet intelligence became a case about a New York husband and wife. The charge against them would be conspiracy to commit espionage. That distinction is essential, though easy to lose in the memory of the case. Julius and Ethel Rosenberg were not convicted of the separate constitutional crime of treason. They were convicted of joining a conspiracy. In practice, that meant the prosecution built its case around an alleged network and shared purpose, not only around one completed act. Relationships mattered. Meetings mattered. Testimony about who knew what, who said what, and who helped whom became central. For Julius Rosenberg, later historical evidence has sharpened the picture. National Security Agency materials from the VENONA releases identified Julius with Soviet code names including Liberal and Antenna. Those materials were not presented to the jury at trial. They became public decades later after the first public release of translated VENONA messages in July of 1995. Their significance lies partly in timing. The jury did not see them. The public did not know them during the trial, the appeals, or the Clemency fight. But they later changed the historical argument by strongly supporting Julius Rosenberg's espionage activity. Ethel Rosenberg's role remains more contested. That does not mean she was untouched by the case or outside its circle. She was Julius's wife, David Greenglass's sister, and part of the family structure through which the prosecution told its story. But the most dramatic courtroom claim against her, that she typed atomic notes for transmission to the Soviets, would later come under serious question. National Archives grand jury releases beginning in 2008 and reporting by the National Security Archive undermined that central typing claim. David Greenglass himself later publicly admitted that he had lied about some testimony connected to Ethel's alleged typing role. This is why the Rosenbergs cannot honestly be treated as simple villains or simple martyrs. The archive does not support innocence as a blanket statement. It also does not support every certainty that the courtroom drama produced. Julius's later evidentiary record and Ethel's disputed role pull the story in different directions. The temptation is to collapse that tension into one moral verdict, but the case is more revealing when the tension remains visible. It reveals how the early Cold War worked on American life. The fear was not only of the Soviet Union abroad, it was of hidden loyalties at home. It was of neighbors, workers, scientists, couriers, and family members who might serve another power while living inside ordinary American institutions. In this atmosphere, communism was not treated simply as a political belief. It was often treated as evidence of potential betrayal, a sign that private conviction could become foreign service. New York was a particularly charged setting for that fear. The city was home to immigrant communities, labor politics, left-wing associations, federal offices, newspapers, lawyers, and activists. It was also the place where the Rosenberg trial would unfold in the U.S. District Court for the Southern District of New York before Judge Irving R. Kaufman. The trial itself took place from March 6th to March 29th, 1951. Julius and Ethel Rosenberg were tried with Morton Sobell, who was also convicted. The presence of Sobell helped reinforce the prosecution's larger claim. This was not a single household matter, but a broader espionage conspiracy. Still, the emotional power of the case came from the household. Prosecutors could point to the machinery of Soviet espionage, but the public saw a married couple. The testimony turned relatives into witnesses and family memory into legal evidence. David Greenglass was not just a Los Alamos machinist in the courtroom story. He was Ethel's brother. Ruth Greenglass was not just another witness. She was David's wife. These connections gave the case its intimacy, and intimacy made it more painful. The government's concern was not imaginary. Soviet atomic espionage was real. The United States did lose nuclear secrets to Soviet intelligence networks, but the justice system still had to decide individual guilt, degree of involvement, and punishment. That is where the Rosenberg case became a dividing line. To some Americans, the trial showed that the country was finally confronting a hidden communist threat. To others, it showed that fear had overwhelmed fairness, especially in Ethel's case. The Rosenbergs stood at the intersection of these meanings. Julius was born in New York, lived through the rise of wartime alliance and post-war suspicion, and would later be linked by declassified intelligence materials to Soviet espionage. Ethel, born in New York City 3 years before him, became one of the most controversial figures in American legal history because the evidence against her depended so heavily on testimony later challenged by the archival record. Their shared name became a national symbol, but the archive keeps separating them in important ways. That separation is not a technical detail. It is the heart of the case's afterlife. If Julius's espionage activity is strongly supported by later evidence, then the Rosenberg prosecution cannot be dismissed as pure invention. If Ethel's precise role remains contested, then the punishment of both spouses as equal participants remains historically and morally unsettled. The case forces both ideas into the same frame. By the early 1950s, the United States was primed to see atomic espionage as more than spying. It looked like a breach in the wall that had protected the nation's most powerful secret. The Soviet atomic test of 1949 made that breach feel urgent, and the Korean War intensified fears of communist expansion. The Rosenbergs became the human face of that anxiety, New Yorkers accused of helping an enemy power at the dawn of the nuclear age. But before the courtroom could turn their lives into a legal narrative, the bomb itself had to become the central object of fear. The investigation that reached the Rosenbergs drew its force from Los Alamos, from the Manhattan Project, from the belief that atomic knowledge had crossed lines it was never supposed to cross. To understand why the government treated this New York family case as a national emergency, we have to follow the secret that made it so powerful, the bomb, and the broken monopoly that surrounded it. The secret that made the Rosenberg case so powerful was not simply that information had been stolen. Governments had always feared spies. What changed after the Second World War was the scale of what a secret could mean. The atomic bomb was not a better rifle, a faster aircraft, or a more accurate artillery shell. It was a weapon that seemed to alter the structure of world power itself. For a short time after the war, The United States possessed what was often described as an atomic monopoly. That phrase mattered. It implied not only possession of the bomb, but control over the knowledge needed to build it. It suggested that American laboratories, military officials, security systems, and classified files had succeeded in containing the most dangerous technical achievement of the age. Then, in 1949, the Soviet Union tested an atomic bomb. The meaning of that test was immediate and unsettling. It told American officials that the monopoly had ended much sooner than many had expected. It raised a question that would shape the Rosenberg case before the trial ever began. Had the Soviet Union caught up through its own scientific work, through espionage, or through some combination of both? The Department of Energy's history of the Manhattan Project gives a careful answer. It does not say that espionage created the Soviet bomb from nothing. It says Soviet atomic espionage probably hastened the Soviet atomic bomb by approximately 12 to 18 months. That estimate is important because it places the espionage in a specific historical frame. The stolen information did not replace Soviet science, but it may have shortened the path. In the early Cold War, a year or a year and a half was not a small amount of time. It was strategic time. It was time in which policy, military planning, diplomacy, and public fear all moved quickly. That is why the government did not treat atomic espionage as ordinary spying. If atomic information had helped the Soviet Union reach the bomb sooner, then the crime was not just the transfer of papers or drawings. It became, in the eyes of officials and prosecutors, an acceleration of danger. It suggested that a person inside the United States could alter the balance between superpowers without firing a weapon. To understand the charge in that atmosphere, we have to return to the place where the American bomb had been made, Los Alamos, New Mexico. During the Manhattan Project, Los Alamos was the secret wartime site associated with Project Y. It was built to gather scientists, engineers, soldiers, machinists, and technicians around a single urgent problem: producing an atomic weapon before the enemy could. It was geographically remote, administratively controlled, and surrounded by secrecy. Its work depended on compartmentalization, code names, clearances, and the belief that a vast scientific industrial project could be hidden inside the American war effort. But secrecy on that scale had a paradox inside it. The more complex the project became, the more people it required. The more people it required, the more vulnerable it became to human passageways, insiders, couriers, ideological commitments, personal relationships, and small acts that might not look dramatic at the moment they occurred. Los Alamos was not just a place of equations and laboratory instruments. It was also a workplace. People machined parts, prepared materials, carried instructions, made sketches, handled documents, and moved through a system whose power depended on thousands of tasks being performed correctly and quietly. Among those who worked there was David Greenglass, Ethel Rosenberg's brother, a machinist whose later testimony would become central to the prosecution's account. The bomb at the center of this history was also not an abstraction. The Manhattan Project assembled and tested its first nuclear device, known as the Gadget. That device belonged to the implosion-type category of atomic bomb design, a design problem that required extraordinary precision. In broad terms, implosion meant forcing material inward in a carefully controlled way, compressing it rapidly and symmetrically. It was not simply a question of having radioactive material. The design itself mattered. Timing mattered. Shape mattered. The arrangement of parts mattered. That is why, when the Rosenberg prosecution later focused on sketches and descriptive information related to an atomic bomb, the courtroom significance was larger than the appearance of the material might suggest. A sketch could be made to stand for access. A drawing could be presented as a bridge between Los Alamos and a foreign intelligence service. A technical description could become evidence that the secret city had leaked. The prosecution would eventually claim that David Greenglass passed Julius Rosenberg a sketch and descriptive material related to an atomic bomb. The FBI later identified Government Exhibit 8 as Greenglass's trial sketch of a cross-section of an atom bomb. The full disputes around that testimony belong later in the story, because they involve the trial, the witnesses, and the contested role of Ethel Rosenberg. But for this moment, what matters is why such an exhibit could carry such weight. It carried weight because by 1951, when the Rosenberg trial unfolded in Manhattan, The Soviet bomb was no longer theoretical. The United States had already seen its atomic monopoly broken. Officials were no longer arguing only about whether secrets might be lost. They were looking backward from an event that had already happened and asking who had helped it happen sooner. That backward-looking fear gave the case its force. It allowed prosecutors to connect individual acts to global consequences. A meeting was not just a meeting. A courier was not just a courier. A family relationship was not just a family relationship. In the Cold War atmosphere, each could be interpreted as part of a chain that reached from a New York apartment to Los Alamos, from Los Alamos to Soviet intelligence, and from Soviet intelligence to the end of American nuclear exclusivity. The power of that narrative should not be confused with proof of every claim made in court. The historical record that later emerged is more complicated. It strongly supports Julius Rosenberg's espionage activity through later materials, including VENONA-related evidence discussed elsewhere in this episode arc. It also leaves Ethel Rosenberg's precise role contested, especially in light of later grand jury releases and later admissions connected to David Greenglass's testimony. But those later complexities were not what the jury saw in the same way at the time. The trial took place inside an atmosphere already shaped by the Soviet atomic test and by a government convinced that atomic secrets had moved through clandestine channels. The Department of Energy's estimate of 12 to 18 months helps explain that atmosphere without overstating it. It gives the fear a measure. If espionage hastened the Soviet bomb by approximately that span, then the government could argue that the effect of spying was real, even if Soviet scientists had their own capabilities. That distinction is historically important. It prevents the story from becoming a myth in which one stolen secret single-handedly creates a superpower's arsenal. But it also prevents the opposite myth in which espionage made no difference. The evidence-based position is more restrained and more troubling. Information passed from inside the atomic world may have shortened the timeline of nuclear rivalry. And in the early Cold War, the timeline was everything. The Soviet atomic test of 1949 was followed by a sharper, more anxious national security climate. The Korean War intensified fears of communist expansion. Domestic anti-communism grew more aggressive. Institutions like the FBI, federal prosecutors, and congressional investigators operated in a public environment where secrecy and loyalty were not merely administrative concerns. They were political and moral questions. This is the climate in which a conspiracy case could become a death penalty case. The Rosenbergs were not charged with treason. They were convicted of conspiracy to commit espionage. But the emotional and political meaning attached to the alleged conspiracy came from the bomb. Without Los Alamos, without Project Y, without the gadget, without the implosion-type design problem, and without the Soviet test that ended the monopoly, the case would not have carried the same national charge. Atomic secrecy also shaped the public's understanding of the trial in another way. Much of what mattered most was hidden. The Manhattan Project had been secret. Intelligence work remained secret. Later, records that would reshape historical understanding, including VENONA materials and grand jury transcripts, were not publicly available to the people watching the case unfold in real time. The public saw courtroom testimony, newspaper accounts, official statements, and a handful of physical exhibits. Behind those visible pieces were classified systems that ordinary citizens could not inspect. That gap between what the government knew, what it could reveal, and what it chose to present is one of the defining features of secret America. In the Rosenberg case, it meant that the public story was built from fragments. Some fragments were later strengthened by archival evidence. Others were later weakened or called into question. But during the prosecution, the broken atomic monopoly gave those fragments a terrifying coherence. The bomb made the case feel larger than the defendants. It turned alleged espionage into a story about national survival. It made Los Alamos not just a wartime laboratory in New Mexico, but a breached vault. It made a sketch into a symbol of vulnerability. It made the distance between a machinist, a courier, and a Soviet intelligence contact feel short enough to imagine and dangerous enough to punish severely. From that point forward, investigators did not have to begin with Julius and Ethel Rosenberg. The path that reached them began elsewhere, with another physicist, another confession, and another channel through which atomic information was said to have moved. The fear had already been created by the broken monopoly. What remained was to trace the human chain that investigators believed had helped break it. The fear had already been created by the broken monopoly. What investigators needed was a path through it, not an abstract suspicion that secrets had escaped Los Alamos, but a chain of people, meetings, and admissions that could be turned into a case. In the FBI's account of the Rosenberg investigation, that chain did not begin in a New York apartment. It began across the Atlantic with Klaus Fuchs. Fuchs was a German-born physicist. He had worked inside the world of atomic research, the same world whose secrecy had become central to American national security after the war. In 1950, he was arrested in Britain. He was later convicted under the British Official Secrets Act. The language of that statute matters. This was not yet the Rosenberg trial. It was not a Manhattan courtroom, not Judge Irving R. Kaufman, not Julius and Ethel sitting beside Morton Sobell. It was a British official secrets case, grounded in the idea that wartime scientific knowledge had been entrusted to a limited circle and that someone inside that circle had violated that trust. But intelligence investigations do not always remain inside the borders where they begin. A confession in Britain could become a lead in the United States. A physicist could point toward a courier. A courier could point toward a soldier or machinist. And a wartime transfer of information could become, years later, the spine of a federal conspiracy prosecution. That is why Fuchs occupies such an important place in the early investigative story. He was not presented to the American public as merely a foreign spy in a foreign case. In the structure later described by the FBI, he became the first visible break in a hidden network. His case suggested that atomic espionage had not been a vague fear or a political slogan. It had moved through people. The next name in that chain was Harry Gold. Gold's role was different from Fuchs's. He was not the scientist whose access made the secret valuable. He was identified as a courier in the atomic espionage investigation. In the architecture of spy work, the courier is often less dramatic than the scientist and less visible than the handler, but the courier can be the connective tissue of the entire case. A courier turns knowledge into movement. A courier makes distance manageable. A courier can connect a laboratory in New Mexico, a contact in another city, and an intelligence service that wants information without exposing its sources too quickly. In the Rosenberg story, Gold mattered because his role helped connect investigators from Fuchs toward David Greenglass. This was the crucial narrowing of the investigation. Atomic espionage, as a national fear, was enormous. It involved the Soviet Union, the Manhattan Project, the end of America's brief atomic monopoly, and the possibility that wartime secrets had shortened the road to a Soviet bomb. But a prosecution could not rest on atmosphere alone. It needed names. It needed roots. It needed testimony that could be placed before a jury. The FBI's account traces the movement from Klaus Fuchs to Harry Gold, then from Harry Gold to David Greenglass, and from there toward Julius and Ethel Rosenberg. That sequence is not just a list of suspects. It is a map of how a counterintelligence concern became a criminal case. Fuchs's arrest and conviction gave investigators a starting point that had the authority of an official proceeding. Gold's place in the story gave them a mechanism. Greenglass would give them a family link and a Los Alamos connection. Once those elements were joined, the case could begin to look less like scattered wartime leakage and more like an alleged conspiracy. The word alleged is important here because this chapter is following the investigative chain as identified in government accounts, not asking the listener to accept every later courtroom claim without question. The Rosenberg case is powerful partly because so many pieces of it were documented, and partly because some of the most dramatic claims would later be debated, revised, or undermined as records opened. That tension runs through the entire case. The archives do not erase the prosecution story, but they do change how carefully it has to be read. In 1950, however, investigators were not operating with the distance of later historians. They were working in the immediate aftermath of the Soviet atomic test of 1949. They were working in a country where the bomb had become a measure of national survival. They were working with the belief that Soviet espionage had probably hastened the Soviet atomic bomb by approximately 12 to 18 months, according to the Department of Energy's later Manhattan Project history. That belief made each link in the chain feel urgent. Fuchs was not just a man who had violated secrecy. Gold was not just a messenger. Greenglass would not be treated as just a former machinist. Each person became part of a larger explanation for how atomic knowledge had crossed from a closed American wartime project into Soviet hands. The investigative movement from Fuchs to Gold also shows something essential about secret America. The public usually sees the case only after the chain has already been assembled. By the time names appear in court, they can seem inevitable. But investigations are built through smaller acts of recognition and pressure. A confession that points outward, a courier who becomes traceable, an identification that opens the next door. Gold's identification of David Greenglass helped lead investigators to Greenglass. That is the hinge. Without it, the Rosenberg case might have remained separated from Los Alamos by too many uncertainties. With it, the government's story could move from the physicist to the courier to the insider at the secret wartime site. Greenglass was not an abstract figure. He was Ethel Rosenberg's brother. He had worked as a machinist at Los Alamos during the Manhattan Project. That family connection would later become one of the most consequential and painful parts of the case. It meant the investigation was no longer only about an espionage route. It was also about siblings, marriage, loyalty, pressure, and testimony inside a family. Here, the machinery of counterintelligence began to merge with the machinery of domestic life. The same path that linked Fuchs to Gold also began to point toward a New York family network. The government's future courtroom narrative would depend heavily on that merger, a secret scientific city in New Mexico, connected to a courier, connected to David Greenglass, connected to Julius Rosenberg, and eventually to Ethel Rosenberg. That does not mean every link carried the same evidentiary weight. Later evidence would strongly support Julius Rosenberg's espionage activity. Ethel Rosenberg's precise role would remain far more contested, especially after grand jury materials and later reporting raised serious questions about the most dramatic courtroom claim against her. But in the early investigative chain, before the trial fixed the story into testimony, what mattered was direction. Fuchs led to Gold. Gold led to Greenglass. Greenglass would lead investigators closer to the Rosenbergs. The chain also reveals why the case was charged as conspiracy to commit espionage. A conspiracy case is built around connection. Who knew whom, who met whom, who passed what, who intended what, and how separate acts could be interpreted as parts of one plan. The Fuchs to Gold to Greenglass sequence gave the government a way to narrate espionage as a network rather than as a single theft. That network structure would become central in Manhattan. It made a courier important. It made a recognition device important. It made sketches and descriptions important. It made family testimony important. And it allowed prosecutors to argue that the danger was not just one secret lost, but a system of people willing to move secrets. For the archive, this is the moment when the Rosenberg case begins to take its recognizable shape. It is not yet the courtroom drama of March 1951. It is not yet the death sentence of April 5th. It is not yet Sing Sing. It is the investigative phase in which one confession in Britain widened into an American inquiry, and an inquiry began to find names that could be arranged into a chain. At the start of that chain stood Klaus Fuchs, the German-born physicist convicted under the British Official Secrets Act. Then came Harry Gold, the courier whose place in the atomic espionage investigation helped turn an overseas confession into a domestic trail. And then came David Greenglass, the Los Alamos machinist whose testimony would carry the story deeper into the Manhattan Project and into the Rosenberg family itself. By the time investigators reached Greenglass, the case had crossed a boundary. It was no longer only about how atomic secrets might have moved. It was about who inside Los Alamos was said to have helped move them, what he was said to have drawn, and how a wartime sketch could become a government exhibit in a trial that divided the country. By the time investigators reached David Greenglass, the atomic espionage story had moved from confession to courier, and from courier to family. Klaus Fuchs had been a physicist. Harry Gold had been a go-between. Greenglass was something different in the public imagination, an ordinary American soldier and machinist who had worked inside Los Alamos, the hidden wartime community where the bomb was built. That made his place in the case unusually powerful. He was not presented as a distant sympathizer or a political organizer. He was presented as someone who had been near the machinery of the Manhattan Project itself. And he was Ethel Rosenberg's brother. Los Alamos, New Mexico, had already become more than a location in the Rosenberg case. It was the symbol of the secret America created during the Second World War, a remote scientific city connected to Project Y, tied to the gadget, and wrapped in military silence. But the prosecution's case did not depend on describing Los Alamos only as a place of genius and secrecy. It depended on showing that secrecy had human seams. People came and went. Workers handled parts, tools, drawings, shop orders, and technical fragments. Inside a project designed for compartmentalization, knowledge could still collect in the hands of people who were not famous physicists. David Greenglass worked there as a machinist during the Manhattan Project. That detail mattered because it placed him physically inside the atomic weapons program, but not at its scientific summit. He was not Klaus Fuchs. He was not one of the celebrated theoretical minds associated with the design of the bomb. He was a technical worker in a wartime production world, close enough, the government argued, to obtain and describe certain information, and close enough to give the prosecution a bridge from Los Alamos to New York. In the trial narrative, Greenglass became the witness who carried atomic information out of the secret city and into the Rosenberg family circle. The government's claim was that he passed Julius Rosenberg a sketch and descriptive material related to an atomic bomb. This was one of the central points that made the case sound, to a jury and to the public, like more than a political conspiracy. It gave the allegation a specific object, a drawing, an explanation, a piece of technical information that could be imagined leaving Los Alamos and entering an espionage channel. The prosecution did not have to prove treason. That legal distinction will become important later. The charge was conspiracy to commit espionage, but the emotional center of the case depended on something more vivid than a legal theory. It depended on making the conspiracy visible. Greenglass's testimony helped do that. He was not merely saying that people had talked. He was saying that he had provided information connected to the weapon that had changed the war and altered the balance between the United States and the Soviet Union. The most remembered part of that claim is the sketch. In the FBI's identification of trial materials, Government Exhibit 8 was Greenglass's trial sketch of a cross-section of an atom bomb. The phrase is stark and almost bureaucratic, Government Exhibit 8. But its meaning in the courtroom was much larger. It transformed the abstract fear of atomic espionage into a physical exhibit that could be shown, marked, discussed, and argued over. It suggested that the secret was not only whispered. It could be drawn. The prosecution's account, as presented at trial, was that Greenglass gave Julius Rosenberg a sketch and descriptive material related to an atomic bomb. That account placed Julius at the receiving end of information from Los Alamos, and it made Greenglass both witness and participant. It also connected the world of wartime secrecy to the world of family trust. David was Ethel's brother. Julius was Ethel's husband. In a case already charged with fear of communist subversion, the family connection made the alleged network feel intimate and difficult to detect. This is one reason the Greenglass evidence had such force. It did not describe espionage as something done by strangers in trench coats, passing documents in foreign capitals. It described a domestic circuit, a brother, a brother-in-law, a wife, a courier, a meeting, a drawing. The government story moved through apartments and family relationships as much as through military installations. And that was part of why the Rosenberg case became so disturbing to so many Americans. If the prosecution was right, the line between private life and national security had collapsed. But to tell this part of the story responsibly, we have to hold two things at once. First, David Greenglass's testimony was central to the government's case. He testified that he gave Julius Rosenberg a sketch and descriptive material related to an atomic bomb. The FBI identified Government Exhibit 8 as Greenglass's trial sketch of a cross-section of an atom bomb. Those are facts about the case as it was built and presented. Second, the meaning and reliability of Greenglass's testimony have been debated for decades. Later scrutiny of the Rosenberg case, especially after archival releases, did not leave every courtroom claim untouched. In particular, later National Archives grand jury releases and reporting by the National Security Archive undermined the dramatic courtroom claim that Ethel Rosenberg typed atomic notes for transmission to the Soviets. David Greenglass later publicly admitted that he had lied about some testimony connected to Ethel's alleged piping role. That later dispute belongs most directly to the story of Ethel and we will return to it carefully. But it matters here because it changes the way we listen to Greenglass. He was not only a source of evidence, he was also a contested witness whose words shaped the fate of his sister and brother-in-law. His testimony helped connect Los Alamos to Julius Rosenberg. It also helped form part of the broader family story that made Ethel vulnerable in the courtroom. When later records and admissions complicated that story, they forced historians to separate different layers of the case: what the government proved or claimed at trial, what later evidence supports, and what remains disputed. In this chapter, the point is not to decide more than the record supports. The point is to understand why Greenglass mattered. He mattered because he gave the prosecution a Los Alamos insider. He mattered because he turned a national anxiety into a narrative of access and transfer. He mattered because the case against Julius Rosenberg was not built only around ideology or association, but around allegations that specific wartime information moved through him. And he mattered because the evidence attached to his testimony, including Government Exhibit 8, gave the courtroom something tangible to look at. There is a quiet power in a trial exhibit. It does not need to be beautiful or complete. It does not need to explain the full science of an implosion-type atomic bomb design. In court, an exhibit can do something simpler and more persuasive. It can give a story a surface. A jury can see it. Lawyers can point to it. Witnesses can be asked about it. A document or drawing can become a marker that says, "This is where the abstract became real." For the government, Government Exhibit 8 was part of that transformation. The alleged secret was no longer only atomic information. It had a number in the trial record. It had a description. It had a witness attached to it. It had a route from Los Alamos through David Greenglass toward Julius Rosenberg and into the alleged espionage network. For the defense and for later critics, the same exhibit and the same testimony raised different questions. How much technical value did the sketch actually have? What exactly did Greenglass know? How accurate was his description? How should a jury weigh testimony from a cooperating witness who was himself implicated? And how much of the family-centered story was reliable, especially when later revelations cast doubt on some of the most damaging testimony about Ethel? Those questions are why the Rosenberg case did not end when the trial ended. They are also why the archive remains so important. The case lives in testimony, exhibits, government files, grand jury transcripts, and later intelligence releases. It lives in the gap between what jurors heard in March of 1951 and what the public learned decades later. At Los Alamos, the Manhattan Project had tried to create a secure system around knowledge. But the Rosenberg prosecution argued that knowledge escaped through people, through memory, conversation, sketches, meetings, and couriers. David Greenglass became the figure who made that argument plausible in court. He was the machinist who had been there. He was the family link. He was the man who said he had drawn and passed along material connected to the bomb. And once the prosecution had a sketch, it could build around it. The atomic secret could be placed on a courtroom table. The jury could be asked to see not only a conspiracy, but its artifacts. Yet the Rosenberg case was never made from technical drawings alone. It was also made from small objects, ordinary objects, things that seemed almost absurd beside the scale of nuclear war. The same trial record that contained an alleged cross-section of an atom bomb also contained a cheap grocery package used, according to the government, as a recognition device. In that contrast lay the strange texture of the case. The bomb at one end, the kitchen shelf at the other, and between them a story of secrecy made visible one exhibit at a time. The sketch made the alleged atomic secret visible, but the Jell-O Box did something different. It made the alleged network visible. That is why such an ordinary object sits so strangely in the Rosenberg case. In a story filled with Los Alamos, Project Y, implosion-type design, and the fear that the Soviet atomic bomb had arrived sooner than expected, one of the most memorable trial exhibits was not a scientific diagram. It was a grocery package. A cheap, familiar container from everyday American life placed into the solemn machinery of a federal courtroom. The National Archives preserves the Jell-O Box recognition device in records from the Rosenberg trial, which ran from March 6th to March 29th, 1951. Its survival in the archive matters. It is not only a reminder of what prosecutors said had happened, It is a reminder of how espionage cases are often built for a jury, not only through ideology, not only through expert testimony, not only through classified fear, but through things that can be handled, labeled, displayed, and remembered. The object's importance came from the prosecution's account of spycraft. In that account, people who did not necessarily know one another by ordinary social means needed a way to recognize one another. Espionage depends on trust, but it also depends on distrust. A courier has to know that the person approaching him is the right person. A contact has to be able to confirm identity without asking the kind of question that gives everything away. A recognition device solves that problem by turning an everyday object into a signal. In the Rosenberg case, the Jell-O Box filled that role. It was presented as a device by which participants in the alleged espionage network could identify one another. In practical terms, that made it small. In courtroom terms, it made it large. Because the government's case was not simply that information had existed at Los Alamos, the government's case was that information moved. It moved through human beings. It moved through a chain that investigators traced from Klaus Fuchs to Harry Gold, from Gold to David Greenglass, and then toward Julius and Ethel Rosenberg. To make that chain persuasive, prosecutors needed more than a general atmosphere of suspicion. They needed scenes. They needed meetings. They needed methods. The Jell-O Box helped provide a method. There is something almost jarring about the scale of it. On one side of the case stood the atomic bomb, the most destructive weapon yet created, born from a secret wartime project and surrounded by military classification. On the other side stood a grocery package associated with dessert. The contrast was not incidental. It was part of what made the exhibit powerful. It suggested that world historical secrets did not always travel through dramatic means. They could pass through ordinary kitchens, city streets, train stations, apartments, or meetings where the most important signal was disguised as something no one would notice. That kind of detail is especially useful in an investigative story because it gives form to the invisible. Espionage is usually difficult to see. Its central actions are concealed by design. The most important exchanges may leave no obvious trace. A courier's route can vanish into normal travel. A conversation can disappear into memory. A document can be copied, passed, or destroyed. An instruction can be spoken once and then denied. A trial, by contrast, asks for evidence that can be organized. It asks for objects, exhibits, testimony, and sequence. The courtroom takes hidden acts and turns them into a narrative that can be followed. The Jell-O Box became one of those organizing objects. It allowed prosecutors to say, in effect, this was not merely a loose political association, not merely a set of beliefs, not merely a family under suspicion. This was a network with procedures. That distinction mattered enormously. The Rosenberg prosecution unfolded in the U.S. District Court for the Southern District of New York before Judge Irving R. Kaufman at a moment when the country was already primed to believe that communist espionage had reached deep into American institutions. The Soviet atomic test of 1949 had shattered the sense that the United States alone controlled nuclear weapons. The Department of Energy's Manhattan Project history later described Soviet espionage as probably hastening the Soviet atomic bomb by approximately 12 to 18 months. In that climate, the government's claim was not heard as an isolated criminal allegation. It was heard against the background of nuclear anxiety. But anxiety alone does not convict. The prosecution had to translate fear into legal proof. It had to show not only that the Soviet Union had sought secrets, and not only that secrets existed, but that particular people had joined a particular conspiracy. In that translation, small objects could become crucial. The Jell-O Box was not important because it contained scientific knowledge. It did not explain an implosion-type atomic bomb. It did not carry the weight of Government Exhibit 8, the sketch identified by the FBI as David Greenglass's trial drawing of a cross-section of an atom bomb. Its value was different. It belonged to the human side of the alleged operation. It suggested preparation, coordination, and prearranged contact. That is why it became memorable. A jury might not understand the technical meaning of a bomb diagram in full. Even scientists and historians have had to treat the technical evidence in the Rosenberg case with care. But a recognition device is easier to grasp. It belongs to the language of spy stories, but also to common sense. If people are meeting secretly, they need to know whom they are meeting. If they are afraid of being watched, they need a signal that looks harmless. A grocery package is harmless by nature. That is what makes it useful. The object also helped compress the case. The Rosenberg story sprawled across institutions and places: Los Alamos in New Mexico, the federal court in Manhattan, the FBI's investigative files, the National Archives, and later the wider world of declassified records and historical debate. The Jell-O Box pulled that sprawl into a single image. It let the public remember the case, not only as an argument about communism and atomic secrets, but as a scene of alleged clandestine recognition. That memory can be misleading if it becomes too neat. An exhibit is not the same as the full truth. A courtroom object carries the meaning that testimony attaches to it. It must be interpreted through the case in which it appears. The Jell-O Box did not speak for itself. Prosecutors gave it a role. Witnesses and lawyers placed it inside a story. The jury was asked to consider it as part of a broader pattern. Defense lawyers, in turn, faced the task of challenging not only statements, but the impression created by such tangible evidence. This is where the archive is both powerful and limited. To see that the Jell-O Box was preserved as a trial exhibit is to feel the physical reality of the proceeding. The case was not only newspaper headlines and later ideological argument. It was also paper, labels, exhibits, and objects handled within a court process. But the archive does not eliminate the need for judgment. It shows what was presented, preserved, and recorded. It does not automatically settle every dispute about meaning, memory, or responsibility. Still, the Jell-O Box reveals something essential about why the Rosenberg trial left such a deep mark. The case was built in the space between the enormous and the ordinary. Atomic secrecy made the alleged crime feel almost limitless in consequence. Family testimony made it intimate. The sketch made it technical. The Jell-O Box made it tactile. And in a conspiracy case, tactility matters. A conspiracy is, by nature, often a crime of connection. It is built from alleged agreements, shared purposes, meetings, introductions, couriers, recognition signals, and acts that may seem small when separated, but become significant when arranged together. The Jell-O Box was one of those small acts made visible. It helped the prosecution invite the jury to see a structure behind the fragments. That structure would become central to everything that followed. Julius and Ethel Rosenberg were not convicted of treason. They were convicted of conspiracy to commit espionage. The difference was not a technical footnote. It shaped the whole case. It meant that the law would focus not only on a completed transfer of secrets, but on the alleged network itself: who knew whom, who met whom, who carried what, who signaled trust, and who shared intent. The Jell-O Box, then, was more than a curiosity. It was a small object that pointed toward the larger legal architecture of the prosecution. In the courtroom, the government did not need the grocery package to explain the bomb. It needed it to help explain the conspiracy. The Jell-O Box helped make the alleged network visible. But the legal force of that network came from the charge itself. Julius and Ethel Rosenberg were not convicted of treason. They were convicted of conspiracy to commit espionage. That distinction can sound narrow, even technical. In the Rosenberg case, it was anything but. It shaped what prosecutors had to prove, what witnesses were asked to describe, and why association became so powerful in the courtroom. The government did not have to present the case as a completed act of constitutional treason. It did not have to prove that the defendants had levied war against the United States, or that they had adhered to an enemy in the specific constitutional sense of that word. Instead, the prosecution built its case around an alleged agreement, a shared purpose to transmit defense information to the Soviet Union. A conspiracy charge turns attention toward relationships. It asks who was connected to whom. It asks whether meetings, messages, objects, and introductions were random, or whether they formed a pattern. It asks whether separate acts can be understood as parts of one plan. In the Rosenberg case, that mattered because the story the government presented was never simply one person handing over one document. It was a structure. Klaus Fuchs in Britain, Harry Gold as courier, David Greenglass at Los Alamos, Julius Rosenberg in New York, Ethel Rosenberg, according to the prosecution, within the family and apartment life of that alleged operation. Morton Sobell as part of the wider case. The indictment and trial strategy placed the emphasis on conspiracy to commit espionage. That meant the alleged network itself became evidence. A courier's route mattered. A recognition device mattered. A sketch mattered. A family meeting mattered. A remembered conversation mattered. The law allowed prosecutors to argue that these fragments were not isolated, but mutually reinforcing. Each one could help explain the others. This is why the case had such a particular courtroom texture. It was not only about atomic science, although atomic science gave the prosecution its urgency. It was not only about Los Alamos, although Los Alamos gave the story its secret center. It was about the movement of trust. How did a person know that a stranger was safe to meet? How did information pass from a restricted wartime site to a courier? How did a courier know whom to approach? How did family ties become, in the government's telling, channels of espionage? The answer offered by the prosecution was conspiracy. The alleged participants did not have to perform the same act. They did not have to know every detail known by every other participant. What mattered was the claim that they were joined by intent and by action toward a shared unlawful purpose. In that kind of case, the courtroom becomes a place where pattern is everything. The earlier investigative chain shows how that pattern was assembled. The FBI's account traces the case from Klaus Fuchs, the German-born physicist arrested in Britain in 1950 and convicted under the British Official Secrets Act. Fuchs's case led investigators toward Harry Gold, described in the atomic espionage investigation as a courier. Gold's role then helped lead investigators toward David Greenglass, Ethel Rosenberg's brother, who had worked as a machinist at Los Alamos during the Manhattan Project. By the time the government reached Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, the case had become more than a trail of individual suspects. It had become an argument about a system. Fuchs represented access to high-level scientific knowledge. Gold represented the courier mechanism. Greenglass represented the insider at Los Alamos, the ordinary machinist in an extraordinary secret city. Julius Rosenberg, in the prosecution's case, represented recruitment, direction, and connection. Ethel Rosenberg's alleged role would become one of the most disputed parts of the entire case, especially because later releases and later statements would undermine central courtroom testimony about her. But at trial, the conspiracy framework allowed prosecutors to place her inside the alleged network, not as a physicist or courier, but as someone they said knowingly assisted the plan. That was the power and danger of the conspiracy charge. It could capture a network that did not operate in the open. It could allow the government to prosecute people accused of working through secrecy, intermediaries, and coded trust. But it also made testimony and inference unusually important. If the government's case depended on proving a shared agreement, then witnesses had to make the invisible visible. They had to describe meetings. They had to remember words. They had to connect domestic scenes to international espionage. They had to persuade a jury that ordinary acts were not ordinary at all. The Jell-O Box was useful for exactly that reason. It was not atomic information. It did not explain implosion design. It did not tell the jury how the gadget worked or what Project Y had built in New Mexico. But as a recognition device, in the prosecution's account, it suggested planning. It suggested that strangers and intermediaries needed a way to identify one another. It made the alleged conspiracy tactile. The government could hold up an object and say, in effect, this is how trust moved. Government Exhibit 8, the sketch David Greenglass made at trial of a cross-section of an atom bomb, served a different purpose. It pointed toward the content of the alleged secret. The Jell-O Box pointed toward the method of connection. Together, they reflected the two halves of the prosecution's story: sensitive information and a network designed to move it. But conspiracy also made association central in a way that still troubles the historical memory of the case. In a moment of intense anti-communist fear, association could carry enormous weight. The early Cold War atmosphere was shaped by the Soviet atomic test of 1949, by the shock that the United States had lost its short-lived atomic monopoly, and by the belief that Soviet espionage had helped accelerate that loss. The Department of Energy's Manhattan Project history later stated that Soviet espionage probably hastened the Soviet atomic bomb by approximately 12 to 18 months. In the political climate of the Rosenberg trial, that kind of assessment speaks to why federal authorities saw atomic spying as something larger than ordinary espionage. The prosecution did not present the case as merely a violation of rules governing classified material. It presented it as part of a Cold War struggle. Yet the charge remained conspiracy to commit espionage. That legal framing mattered because it translated geopolitical fear into courtroom elements: agreement, intent, overt acts, participants, and proof. For the jury, the question became not only whether a document or sketch had moved from one hand to another. It became whether Julius and Ethel Rosenberg had knowingly joined an espionage conspiracy. That placed extraordinary pressure on testimony from people inside or adjacent to the alleged network. David Greenglass was not just a witness about Los Alamos. He was a witness about family, motive, contact, and transmission. Ruth Greenglass was not just a spouse at the edge of the story. Her testimony became part of the government's effort to define what Ethel knew and did. Harry Gold was not just a courier in an abstract sense. His role helped connect the path from one confession to another set of American defendants. This is why courtroom words became so consequential. A conspiracy can be built in the record through recalled conversations, described meetings, and claims about who was present when. It can also be damaged by doubts about memory, motive, pressure, or self-protection. Later archival releases from the National Archives and later reporting by the National Security Archive would make parts of the case against Ethel Rosenberg appear more fragile than the trial presentation suggested. David Greenglass would later publicly admit that he had lied about some testimony connected to Ethel's alleged typing role. Those later developments do not erase the charge that was tried, but they do show why the conspiracy framework made testimony so central and why the reliability of that testimony became a lasting historical question. The case against Julius has also been reshaped by later evidence unavailable to the trial jury. The NSA's VENONA materials identified Julius Rosenberg with Soviet code names including Liberal and Antenna, and those decrypts have strongly supported the conclusion that Julius engaged in espionage activity. But VENONA was not presented to the trial jury. The jurors heard a different kind of case: witnesses, exhibits, associations, and the government's claim of a coordinated conspiracy. So the legal distinction matters because it tells us what kind of trial this was. It was not a simple public unveiling of all intelligence known to the government. It was a criminal proceeding built from admissible evidence, witness narratives, and a charge that made the alleged agreement the center of the story. It was a courtroom attempt to prove a hidden structure. That structure would soon be tested in Manhattan in the U.S. District Court for the Southern District of New York before Judge Irving R. Kaufman. From March 6th to March 29th, 1951, Julius Rosenberg, Ethel Rosenberg, and Morton Sobell sat as defendants while prosecutors, including Roy Cohn and Irving Sapol, and defense attorney Emanuel H. Block, fought over the meaning of the network the government claimed to have uncovered. The conspiracy charge had prepared the ground. The trial would decide whether the fragments could be made into a verdict. By the time the case reached Manhattan, the charge had already shaped the battlefield. The government did not have to present the jury with every secret known to American intelligence. It did not have to prove treason in the constitutional sense. It had to persuade 12 people that an agreement existed, that the agreement was illegal, and that Julius Rosenberg, Ethel Rosenberg, and Morton Sobell were part of it. That is what gave the trial its particular atmosphere. The courtroom in the U.S. District Court for the Southern District of New York became more than a room where testimony was received. It became the place where a hidden Cold War story had to be translated into public language. Files, meetings, confessions, family relationships, courier routes, and alleged recognition signals all had to become something a jury could follow. The trial opened on March 6, 1951. It ran until March 29th. For just over 3 weeks, the federal courthouse in Manhattan held a drama that had been gathering force across continents, from Klaus Fuchs in Britain to Harry Gold as courier to David Greenglass in Los Alamos, and then back to New York, to the Rosenbergs and Morton Sobell. Presiding over the case was Judge Irving R. Kaufman. At the prosecution table were government lawyers associated with the case, including Irving Sapol and Roy Cohn. Sapol, the United States Attorney for the Southern District of New York, represented the institutional voice of the federal government in one of the most charged prosecutions of the early Cold War. Cohn, younger and soon to become far more widely known, was part of the prosecutorial team that pressed the case in court. For the Rosenbergs, the principal defense attorney was Emanuel H. Block. His task was not only to challenge individual witnesses or pieces of evidence. He had to defend a married couple whose case had already been pulled into the national fear of communist subversion and atomic theft. He had to argue inside a legal proceeding while the public meaning of that proceeding was expanding beyond the courtroom. The third defendant, Morton Sobell, sat with Julius and Ethel in the same trial. His presence mattered. It helped the government present the case as something broader than a single household or a single alleged transfer of information. The prosecution was not simply asking the jury to imagine one isolated act. It was asking the jury to see a network. Sobell's trial alongside the Rosenbergs strengthened that frame. Association, coordination, and shared purpose were not background details. They were central to the legal theory. The setting itself carried weight. This was not Los Alamos, the secret wartime laboratory where David Greenglass had worked as a machinist during the Manhattan Project. It was not the hidden world of Project Y, the gadget, or implosion-type bomb design. It was a civilian federal courtroom in Manhattan. That move from secret site to public trial changed the nature of the evidence. Technical claims had to be simplified. Intelligence trails had to be narrated. Objects had to be marked as exhibits. People had to sit under oath and tell the jury what they said had happened. This is one of the most important tensions in the Rosenberg case. The government's larger fear was nuclear and geopolitical. The Soviet atomic test of 1949 had intensified alarm over how quickly the United States had lost its short-lived atomic monopoly. The Department of Energy's Manhattan Project history later summarized the impact of Soviet espionage by saying it probably hastened the Soviet atomic bomb by approximately 12 to 18 months. But in court, that vast fear could not appear only as atmosphere. It needed form. It needed witnesses. It needed dates, meetings, sketches, and small things that could be held up and described. The prosecution's narrative offered that form. It connected Fuchs, Gold, Greenglass, and the Rosenbergs into an account of wartime espionage. It used the language of conspiracy to make the alleged structure legible. The government did not ask the jury merely to consider whether a single document changed hands. It asked the jury to accept that several people had acted in concert, with roles that could be differentiated but connected. That is why the trial record became crowded with different kinds of evidence. There was testimony about the alleged transmission of atomic-related material. There was the claim that David Greenglass gave Julius Rosenberg a sketch and descriptive material related to an atomic bomb. There was Government Exhibit 8, identified by the FBI as Greenglass's trial sketch of a cross-section of an atom bomb. And there was the Jell-O Box recognition device, preserved in National Archives records as a trial exhibit from March 6th to March 29th, 1951. These objects worked differently in the courtroom. The sketch pointed toward Los Alamos and technical secrecy. The Jell-O Box pointed toward spycraft and recognition. Together, they helped turn an alleged secret network into something visible. They gave jurors a way to imagine the hidden world the prosecution described. But the trial was not simply an exhibition of government evidence. It was adversarial. Bloch challenged the prosecution's case and its witnesses. The defense had to confront a difficult problem. The charge of conspiracy allowed the government to build meaning through connection. A meeting, an introduction, a relationship, or an object could become important, not because it proved everything alone, but because it appeared to fit within a larger pattern. To break that pattern, the defense had to isolate the fragments again, to argue that the government's story was not as solid as it sounded. In that sense, the trial was a contest over arrangement. The same names could be placed into different narratives. Julius Rosenberg could be presented by the government as the organizer of a Soviet espionage ring. The defense could push back against the credibility of the witnesses and the assumptions built into that picture. Ethel Rosenberg could be described by prosecutors as part of the conspiracy. The defense could argue against the strength of the evidence, tying her to the alleged acts. Morton Sobell could be linked into the government's wider structure. The defense could question whether association had been made to carry too much legal weight. Judge Kaufman's courtroom was therefore a place where fear became sequence. Cold War anxiety did not arrive as a cloud. It arrived through testimony, one witness after another, and through exhibits placed into evidence. The courtroom took the language of espionage and made it procedural. Who met whom? Who carried what? Who recognized whom? Who said what under oath? Who could be believed? That last question was essential. The prosecution's case depended heavily on witnesses who described hidden acts. In ordinary crimes, visible aftermath may do part of the work: a body, a weapon, a bank record, a fingerprint. In a conspiracy case built around wartime espionage, much of the alleged conduct had to be reconstructed through human memory and human motive. The jurors had to decide not only what had been said, but why it should be trusted. This was especially true because the alleged conspiracy ran through family. David Greenglass was not a distant stranger to Ethel Rosenberg. He was her brother. Ruth Greenglass was not an incidental figure. She was David's wife. Their testimony would place the intimate world of marriage and sibling relationships inside a federal espionage trial. The government could use that intimacy to make the alleged conspiracy seem plausible and close. The defense could use the same intimacy to question pressure, self-interest, and reliability. The courtroom also narrowed what the public could see. Some of the records that later changed historical understanding were not available to the jury. The VENONA materials, later released publicly beginning in July 1995, were not trial evidence. Later National Archives grand jury releases, beginning in 2008, would also alter how historians and the public assessed parts of the case. But in March of 1951, the jury heard the case that was placed before it then, under the rules and pressures of that moment. That distinction matters. The Manhattan trial was not the final archive. It was the public legal narrative available at the time. It transformed a secret investigation into a verdict-ready story, and that story carried the temperature of its era. The Soviet bomb, the fear of domestic communism, the expanding Cold War, and the uncertainty of hidden espionage all pressed against the walls of the courtroom. But inside those walls, the case still had to move through the formal steps of a criminal trial. By March 29, 1951, the courtroom process had done its work. The fragments had been arranged. The government had presented the alleged network. The defense had challenged the shape and credibility of that account. Julius Rosenberg, Ethel Rosenberg, and Morton Sobell had been tried together in a case that asked jurors to treat secrecy itself as something that could be reconstructed. Yet even as the trial ended, one part of the courtroom story would remain especially unstable. It concerned Ethel Rosenberg, and the testimony that placed her not only near the alleged conspiracy, but inside one of its most dramatic scenes. That claim would become one of the deepest wounds in the historical record, because it rested on family testimony that later archives and later admissions would force the country to hear differently. The trial had turned scattered fragments into a legal story. But the most fragile part of that story was not an object, or a sketch, or a code name later found in intelligence files. It was family testimony. At the center of the case against Ethel Rosenberg stood her brother, David Greenglass, and his wife, Ruth Greenglass. David had worked as a machinist at Los Alamos during the Manhattan Project. Ruth, through her marriage to David and her connection to the Rosenberg family, became part of the prosecution's account of how information moved from a secret wartime laboratory toward Soviet hands. Their testimony mattered because Ethel's case was different from Julius's case. Later evidence, including National Security Agency materials from the VENONA releases, would strongly support Julius Rosenberg's espionage activity. Those materials identified Julius with Soviet code names, including Liberal and Antenna. But Ethel's precise role remained far more contested. The government needed to show that she was not merely Julius Rosenberg's wife, not merely David Greenglass's sister, not merely someone who lived inside a politically suspect household. It needed to place her inside the alleged conspiracy. The courtroom claim that did that most powerfully was simple, vivid, and devastating. Ethel Rosenberg had typed atomic notes for transmission to the Soviets. In a trial built around secrecy, that image had unusual force. Typing was ordinary. It was domestic, clerical, close at hand. A typewriter could turn rough notes into something portable. It could transform a conversation or a handwritten description into a document ready to be carried by someone else. For a jury hearing about Los Alamos, Harry Gold, the Jell-O Box recognition device, and Government Exhibit 8, the alleged typing scene gave Ethel a concrete act. It made her visible in the prosecution's version of the network. That is why the claim mattered so much. It was not just a detail. It was the courtroom bridge between association and participation. David Greenglass had already become a crucial witness because of his place in the investigative chain. The FBI's account traced the atomic espionage trail from Klaus Fuchs, the German-born physicist arrested in Britain in 1950 and convicted under the British Official Secrets Act, to Harry Gold, the courier, and from Gold to Greenglass. David's work at Los Alamos gave him access to information from inside the Manhattan Project world. At trial, he testified that he gave Julius Rosenberg a sketch and descriptive material related to an atomic bomb. That testimony helped the government connect Julius to atomic espionage. But to connect Ethel, the prosecution leaned on the family circle. In that circle, the witnesses were not distant observers. They were relatives. They were people whose lives were entangled with the defendants before they ever entered a federal courtroom in Manhattan. This is one of the reasons the Rosenberg case has remained so difficult to hold at a single angle. Family testimony can feel intimate, as if it carries the weight of private knowledge. But it can also carry pressure, fear, self-protection, resentment, and bargaining. In this case, the family relationship did not soften the courtroom. It sharpened it. David Greenglass was Ethel's brother. Ruth Greenglass was David's wife. Their testimony helped define the role that prosecutors assigned to Ethel. The government's account did not depend only on showing that Ethel was near Julius. It depended on testimony that she helped with the work of espionage. The typing allegation served that purpose. For years, that courtroom scene stood as part of the public memory of the case. Ethel at the typewriter. Atomic notes being prepared. Family members describing her role. The image was direct enough to survive in headlines, arguments, petitions, and accusations. It helped shape the moral meaning of the verdict because it suggested action, not silence. But the archive did not remain still. Beginning in 2008, the National Archives released formerly secret Rosenberg grand jury transcripts. These included testimony from Ethel Rosenberg, Ruth Greenglass, Harry Gold, and others. The importance of these records was not simply that they added more pages to a famous case. They allowed historians, journalists, lawyers, and the public to compare earlier sworn testimony with the later courtroom story. The National Security Archive reported that the released grand jury testimony contradicted the central courtroom claim that Ethel Rosenberg typed atomic notes for transmission to the Soviets. That finding cut directly into one of the most dramatic elements of the prosecution's presentation against her. The issue was not whether Soviet espionage had existed. It had. The issue was not whether Julius Rosenberg had been connected to espionage activity. Later materials strongly support that he was positive. The issue was narrower and more painful. What exactly had Ethel done, and how reliable was the testimony used to prove it? The grand jury releases mattered because they moved the dispute from political slogan into documentary comparison. They gave later readers a way to examine what had been said before trial, what was said at trial, and how the story changed. In a case where so much had been hidden behind classification, sealed testimony, and Cold War urgency, the release of grand jury material changed the texture of the evidence. It did not make the past simple. It made it more specific. The typing allegation became one of the clearest examples of that specificity. A claim that had once seemed definite in the courtroom became unstable when measured against later records. The National Security Archive's reporting did not merely add doubt in a general sense. It identified a contradiction at the center of the case against Ethel. That contradiction went to the scene that had made her appear actively involved in preparing atomic information for Soviet transmission. Then came an admission from David Greenglass himself. Years after the trial, he publicly admitted that he had lied about some testimony connected to Ethel's alleged typing role. That admission did not erase the whole Rosenberg case. It did not make every witness false, or every government claim invented. But it did strike at one of the trial's most consequential images. David Greenglass was not a marginal figure. He was Ethel's brother, a Los Alamos machinist, and a central witness in the government's account. When he later acknowledged lying about testimony connected to Ethel's typing, the historical question became even sharper. What happens when a death sentence rests, in part, on testimony later undermined by archives and by the witness's own admission? That question is why Ethel Rosenberg remains at the heart of the case's moral controversy. The dispute is not only about sympathy, it is about proof. It is about the difference between being adjacent to espionage and being an active participant in it. It is about whether a jury in March of 1951 heard a reliable account of her conduct, or whether the most dramatic evidence against her was shaped by pressures that the courtroom did not fully reveal. The family dimension deepened the tragedy. Ethel was not accused by strangers alone. The testimony that helped place her inside the conspiracy came through her own family circle. David and Ruth Greenglass were not just names in a federal file. They were connected by blood, marriage, memory, and fear. Their words carried Ethel toward conviction, and later records forced the country to revisit what those words had meant. In the courtroom of the U.S. District Court for the Southern District of New York, the prosecution had presented the case as a network. That was the power of the conspiracy charge. People, meetings, couriers, sketches, recognition devices, and family ties could be arranged into one narrative of shared intent. Ethel's alleged typing role helped make that narrative feel complete. Without it, her position inside the alleged network looked more uncertain. This is the point where the Rosenberg case divides into two histories. One history concerns Soviet espionage in the United States, a real and serious phenomenon during the era of the Manhattan Project and the early Cold War. The other history concerns the courtroom proof used to condemn particular defendants, especially Ethel Rosenberg. Those histories overlap, but they are not identical. A government can be right that espionage occurred and still face hard questions about how it proved an individual's guilt. A witness can tell the truth about some things and lie about others. A trial can expose a network and still leave behind a wound in the record. By the time later archives opened, the executions had long since taken place. Julius and Ethel Rosenberg had died at Sing Sing Prison in Ossining, New York on June 19, 1953. The legal system could no longer correct the sentence. The only remaining arena was history: transcripts, intelligence releases, institutional records, and the public struggle to understand what had happened. Ethel's story sits there in that difficult space between evidence and consequence. The case against her was not remembered because it was the strongest part of the prosecution. It was remembered because it was the most contested. The claim that she typed atomic notes gave jurors a dramatic act. The later grand jury releases and David Greenglass's admission made that act deeply suspect. And still, the prosecution's larger structure did not depend on Ethel alone. The government had tried Julius and Ethel Rosenberg alongside Morton Sobell, and Sobell's presence helped reinforce the idea that this was not a single family quarrel or one isolated transfer of information. It was presented as a broader conspiracy, a network with more than one node. To understand how the government made that wider case, we have to move from the family testimony surrounding Ethel to the co-defendant whose conviction helped give the alleged network a larger shape. The story of Ethel Rosenberg drew much of its force from the intimacy of family testimony. A brother, a sister, a wife, a kitchen table, a typewriter, and notes said to have moved from Los Alamos towards Soviet hands. But the prosecution did not ask the jury to see the case only as a family drama. It asked the jury to see a system. That is where Morton Sobell mattered. Sobell was tried in the U.S. District Court for the Southern District of New York alongside Julius and Ethel Rosenberg. The trial ran from March 6th to March 29th, 1951, before Judge Irving R. Kaufman. Julius and Ethel were the names that would become inseparable from the case and from the execution that followed. But in the courtroom itself, there were three defendants. Sobell's presence helped the government make a broader claim that this was not a single act of disloyalty, not one handoff, not one family channel, but a conspiracy with more than one participant and more than one point of contact. That distinction mattered because the charge was conspiracy to commit espionage. The prosecution did not have to prove treason in the constitutional sense. It did not have to present the story as one finished transfer of one finished secret. It could instead build its case around agreement, association, meetings, couriers, and shared intent. A conspiracy case is partly about what people did and partly about how those actions are connected. It turns isolated fragments into a pattern. Sobell's role in the trial helped make that pattern visible to the jury. In the government's larger account, the trail had already moved through a sequence of names and places: Klaus Fuchs in Britain, Harry Gold as a courier, David Greenglass at Los Alamos, and then Julius and Ethel Rosenberg in New York. Each step gave the prosecution a way to widen the frame. Fuchs, a German-born physicist, had been arrested in Britain in 1950 and convicted under the British Official Secrets Act. His case pointed investigators toward gold. Gold's role as a courier helped connect the atomic espionage investigation to David Greenglass. Greenglass, Ethel Rosenberg's brother, had worked as a machinist at Los Alamos during the Manhattan Project. By the time the case reached the Manhattan courtroom, the government was no longer presenting only an intelligence investigation. It was presenting a map. On that map, Los Alamos was not simply a remote wartime laboratory in New Mexico. It was Project Y, the secret scientific center where the Manhattan Project assembled atomic knowledge, including work tied to the first nuclear device, the gadget, and to implosion-type bomb design. New York was not simply the Rosenbergs' home ground. It was the urban setting in which the prosecution said contacts, family links, political loyalties, and alleged espionage arrangements overlapped. Couriers gave the map routes. Witnesses gave it voices. Exhibits gave it objects. The Jell-O Box recognition device did important work in that courtroom story. It was a cheap grocery package, but as a trial exhibit, it made alleged spycraft tactile. It suggested planning. It suggested concealment. It suggested that people who might otherwise seem ordinary had been using ordinary things for secret purposes. Government Exhibit 8, identified by the FBI as David Greenglass's trial sketch of a cross-section of an atom bomb, performed a different function. It connected the alleged network to atomic information. The prosecution needed both kinds of evidence, the small physical marker of clandestine contact and the larger claim that wartime defense information had moved toward the Soviet Union. Sobell's conviction reinforced that the jury accepted the government's basic structure. He was not executed, but he was convicted with Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, and that fact became part of the case's lasting shape. The verdict did not isolate the Rosenbergs as a couple standing alone. It affirmed, in legal form, the prosecution's claim that the alleged activity belonged to a wider espionage conspiracy. This is one reason the Rosenberg case became so difficult to separate into clean moral categories. The public memory often narrowed around Julius and Ethel, especially because they were husband and wife, parents, and ultimately the first American civilians executed for conspiracy to commit espionage in the standard historical telling of the case. But the legal architecture was broader than the image of a couple in the dock. It included Sobell. It included Greenglass. It included gold. It included the earlier Fuchs investigation. It included the FBI, the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Southern District of New York, and a federal court operating in the tense atmosphere after the Soviet atomic test of 1949. The government's case drew power from that atmosphere. The Soviet Union's atomic breakthrough had ended America's short-lived monopoly. The Department of Energy's Manhattan Project history later said Soviet espionage probably hastened the Soviet atomic bomb by approximately 12 to 18 months. In the early Cold War, that kind of estimate gave espionage a different emotional weight. It made stolen information feel like lost time. It made a diagram or a description seem connected to global danger. It allowed prosecutors to argue, in effect, that hidden acts in wartime laboratories and apartments had consequences far beyond the people accused. Sobell's presence fit that argument because it helped move the case away from the question of one disputed scene. If Ethel's alleged typing was the most dramatic and later one of the most contested parts of the courtroom story, Sobell represented another kind of prosecution strength, breadth. A conspiracy appears more plausible when it has multiple participants. It appears more dangerous when it is not confined to a single household. It appears more organized when it can be described as a network. And yet, that same breadth also created lasting questions about the way the case was told. A network narrative can clarify. It can show connections that would otherwise be invisible, but it can also gather people into one story under the pressure of fear. In the Rosenberg trial, the jury was asked to follow a chain of evidence through witnesses, exhibits, family relationships, alleged courier activity, and wartime secrecy. The prosecution's task was to make the chain seem coherent. The defense's task was to challenge the links. The historical task, decades later, has been to separate what later records strongly support from what later records weaken or unsettle. That distinction is especially important because the Rosenberg archive did not remain still. VENONA materials, publicly released beginning in July 1995, later reshaped historical understanding of Soviet espionage in the United States. Those materials identified Julius Rosenberg with Soviet codenames including Liberal and Antenna. But VENONA was not presented to the trial jury. The jury judged the case on the courtroom record available in March 1951, not on the declassified intelligence record that would emerge decades later. Likewise, the National Archives' release of formerly secret Rosenberg grand jury transcripts beginning in 2008 changed the public understanding of Ethel Rosenberg's role. The National Security Archive reported that those releases contradicted the Central Courtroom claim that Ethel typed atomic notes for transmission to the Soviets. David Greenglass later publicly admitted that he had lied about some testimony connected to that alleged typing role. These later developments did not erase the fact that the jury convicted all three defendants, but they did remind historians that a legal verdict and a complete historical account are not the same thing. Sobell's place in the case shows why the trial could survive as a prosecution narrative even when one part of it later became deeply suspect. The government had not built a case only on Ethel. It had built a conspiracy structure. Julius, Ethel, and Sobell sat together as defendants. David Greenglass and Ruth Greenglass supplied family testimony. Harry Gold supplied the courier link. Klaus Fuchs stood earlier in the investigative chain. Alamos supplied the wartime secret. The Jell-O Box supplied the symbol of contact. Government Exhibit 8 supplied the image of atomic design. In the courtroom, these pieces were arranged to tell one story. That story was powerful because it translated fear into sequence. First, the secret laboratory. Then, the insider. Then, the courier. Then, the family link. Then, the alleged organizers. Then, the co-defendant who made the case larger than the Rosenberg household. In an archive report, this structure matters as much as any single exhibit because it shows how prosecutors turned counterintelligence into a courtroom narrative. Morton Sobell's conviction did not become the emotional center of the Rosenberg case. History reserved that place for Julius and Ethel, and especially for the contested evidence against Ethel. But Sobell helped define what the case was. He made the prosecution's argument broader, more organized, and more threatening. He helped the jury see not merely defendants, but a network. Once the jury accepted that network, the case moved into a more severe phase. The verdicts were no longer just findings about evidence. They became the foundation for punishment. And on April 5, 1951, Judge Irving R. Kaufman would transform the conspiracy convictions into sentences, placing the courtroom narrative inside the full pressure of the Cold War, the Atomic Age, and the Korean War. The verdicts had given the prosecution its legal victory. Julius Rosenberg, Ethel Rosenberg, and Morton Sobell had been convicted, and the government's theory of a network had survived the courtroom test. But a conviction is not the end of a trial's meaning. In a criminal case, the sentence tells the public what the court believes the crime is worth. On April 5, 1951, in the U.S. District Court for the Southern District of New York, Judge Irving R. Kaufman gave the Rosenberg case the punishment that would make it one of the most disputed legal events of the Cold War. He sentenced Julius and Ethel Rosenberg to death. That fact is simple to state. It was not simple in consequence. The Rosenbergs had not been convicted of treason. They had been convicted of conspiracy to commit espionage. That distinction had mattered throughout the trial, and it mattered even more at sentencing. A treason case would have carried its own constitutional requirements and its own symbolic weight. A conspiracy case worked differently. It allowed the government to build around agreement, intent, association, meetings, couriers, and acts said to advance the shared plan. The jury had accepted that structure. Judge Kaufman now had to decide what punishment should follow from it. The sentence he imposed did more than punish two defendants. It placed their crime inside the larger emergency of the age. Kaufman's sentencing rationale invoked the broad Cold War atmosphere surrounding the case, including the Korean War. In his view, the espionage conspiracy was not merely a past act of wartime disloyalty. It was linked to the dangers then unfolding in the world: Soviet power, atomic fear, communist expansion, and American soldiers fighting in Korea. This is one of the most important turns in the Rosenberg story. The courtroom had heard evidence about wartime events, about Los Alamos, about Harry Gold, David Greenglass, meetings, sketches, and the government's account of secrets moving toward the Soviet Union. But at sentencing, The frame widened. The alleged acts were no longer confined to the 1940s. They were made part of the terrible present of 1951. The Korean War was not background noise. It was active history. American forces were fighting in a conflict that many in the United States understood as part of a global struggle against communism. The Soviet atomic test of 1949 had already destroyed the brief American monopoly on nuclear weapons. The Department of Energy's Manhattan Project history later summarized the effect of Soviet espionage by saying it probably hastened the Soviet atomic bomb by approximately 12 to 18 months. In the early Cold War imagination, even that estimate was enough to turn espionage into something larger than secrecy breached. It became time stolen from national defense. Kaufman's sentence drew from that atmosphere. The prosecution had presented the Rosenbergs as part of an espionage network that helped the Soviet Union obtain atomic-related information. The judge treated that claim not only as an offense against law, but as an offense with world historical consequences. The death sentence depended on that leap, from conspiracy to catastrophe, from courtroom testimony to geopolitical danger. That leap is precisely why the sentence divided the country. For supporters of the prosecution, the punishment matched the fear. If atomic espionage helped a hostile power, and if that power now stood against the United States in a dangerous Cold War, then the crime seemed nearly beyond ordinary categories. It was not a bank robbery. It was not even a conventional spy case. It involved the bomb, and the bomb had changed the scale of punishment people could imagine. For critics, the same sentence looked like proof that the Rosenbergs were being punished for the atmosphere around them as much as for the evidence proved against them. They had been convicted of conspiracy to commit espionage. They had not been tried for causing the Korean War. They had not been convicted of treason. Yet the language of sentencing connected their conduct to the bloodshed and fear of the larger Cold War. That connection made many observers ask whether law had remained law or whether it had become a vessel for national panic. The severity also sharpened the distinction between Julius and Ethel. Later evidence, including National Security Agency VENONA materials that identify Julius Rosenberg with Soviet code names, including Liberal and Antenna, would strongly support Julius Rosenberg's espionage activity. Those materials were not presented to the trial jury, and they belonged to a classified intelligence world that would not reshape public understanding until decades later. But historically, they have altered the way Julius is viewed. Ethel's precise role remains more contested. The trial testimony that placed her in one of the most dramatic acts, typing atomic notes for transmission to the Soviets, was later undermined by National Archives grand jury releases and reporting by the National Security Archive. David Greenglass later publicly admitted that he had lied about some testimony connected to Ethel's alleged typing role. None of that was available to Judge Kaufman in the way later generations would encounter it. But it matters to how the sentence is remembered, because the same punishment fell on both Julius and Ethel, death. That equality of punishment became one of the case's most enduring controversies. The government's courtroom story had presented husband and wife as conspirators. The jury had convicted both, but the historical record that later emerged did not place them with equal clarity inside the espionage apparatus. Julius became more firmly tied to Soviet intelligence activity through later materials. Ethel's role remained more ambiguous, more dependent on disputed family testimony, and more vulnerable to questions about pressure, leverage, and the prosecution's strategy. The death sentence froze those uncertainties into a permanent moral problem. If a prison sentence can be reinterpreted after documents emerge, an execution cannot. That is why the punishment mattered so profoundly. It transformed a disputed trial into an irreversible event. Morton Sobell's sentence also helps reveal the unusual weight placed on Julius and Ethel the Roch. Sobell was convicted with them, and his presence had strengthened the prosecution's argument that the case involved a broader conspiracy rather than a single family transfer. But it was Julius and Ethel who received the punishment that defined the case in public memory. Their sentences turned the trial from a counterintelligence prosecution into a national and international symbol. The court had spoken in the language of law. The country heard the language of fear, justice, revenge, and national survival. Judge Kaufman's courtroom was in Manhattan, but the sentence traveled far beyond the U.S. District Court for the Southern District of New York. It reached newspapers, political organizations, churches, private homes, and eventually the White House. It forced Americans to ask whether espionage in the atomic age required a new scale of punishment, or whether that very fear made fair judgment more difficult. The Rosenberg case had always joined the intimate and the immense. A New York couple, a brother from Los Alamos, a courier, a sketch, a Jell-O box, a federal courtroom. But after April 5, 1951, the center of gravity changed. The question was no longer only whether the government had proved a conspiracy. It was whether the state should take the lives of Julius and Ethel Rosenberg for that conspiracy. That question would not remain inside the trial record. It would move through appeals, petitions, emergency motions, public campaigns, and clemency requests. The legal fight would continue into June of 1953, reaching the Supreme Court and the presidency itself. By then, the sentence Judge Kaufman imposed would no longer be only a punishment awaiting review. It would become a deadline. After Judge Irving R. Kaufman imposed the death sentence, the Rosenberg case entered a different kind of time. The courtroom had produced a verdict. The sentence had fixed a punishment, but the machinery of American law still had corridors left to travel. Appeals could be filed. Emergency motions could be prepared. Petitions could be signed. Arguments could move from the U.S. District Court for the Southern District of New York toward the Supreme Court, and from the prison cell toward the White House. By June of 1953, that machinery was moving under extraordinary pressure. Julius and Ethel Rosenberg were no longer only defendants from a trial that had begun in Manhattan on March 6, 1951. They were condemned prisoners whose case had become a national and international cause. Their names appeared in legal papers, newspapers, protest appeals, and clemency requests. The question had narrowed, but it had also grown larger. It was no longer only what the jury had believed or what Judge Kaufman had said on April 5, 1951. It was whether the institutions of the United States would allow the sentence to be carried out. The late-stage litigation placed the case before the Supreme Court in its final weeks. The official record includes Rosenberg v. United States, 346 U.S. 273, part of the cluster of legal proceedings that reached the court as the execution date approached. In the language of case citations, the matter looks controlled and compressed: party names, volume, reporter, page. But behind that citation was a race against time. Each filing carried the practical question of whether a stay, a rehearing, or some other form of judicial intervention could interrupt the path to Sing Sing Prison in Ossining, New York. The Supreme Court's role mattered because it represented the last judicial level in a case already marked by Cold War intensity. At trial, the prosecution had framed the Rosenbergs as participants in a conspiracy to commit espionage, a network tied by testimony to Los Alamos, David Greenglass, Harry Gold, and the alleged movement of atomic-related information toward the Soviet Union. The defense had fought that account, and the public controversy had only deepened after sentencing. By the time the case reached its final Supreme Court phase, the legal arguments were inseparable from the broader question of legitimacy. Had the trial been fair? Had the punishment been proportional? Was the death sentence a lawful response to conspiracy to commit espionage, or had the political climate of the early Cold War overwhelmed the judgment of the court? The research record allows us to say what the institutions did, even when the moral arguments surrounding those actions remain contested. The Supreme Court considered Rosenberg litigation in June of 1953, including Rosenberg versus United States, 346 U.S. 273. The court did not stop the executions. That fact is central because it shows that the final legal struggle did not end with a dramatic reversal. It ended with the judicial system leaving the sentence in place. At the same time, the case moved through another channel: clemency. Clemency is not the same as appeal. An appeal asks courts to examine legal error. Clemency asks the executive to exercise mercy, restraint, or political judgment, even when the legal process has run its course. In the Rosenberg case, that meant President Dwight D. Eisenhower became part of the final decision. The case moved from the courtroom to the presidency, from the record of trial evidence to the constitutional power of the executive. The Eisenhower Presidential Library preserves Rosenberg documents that include clemency petitions. Their existence matters as archive evidence because they show the case not only as a legal dispute, but as a public appeal directed toward presidential conscience and responsibility. These petitions belong to a wider clemency battle that had moved through churches, newspapers, protest committees, and international public opinion. People who had never sat in the courtroom in Manhattan, who had never examined Government Exhibit 8, who had never heard David Greenglass or Ruth Greenglass testify, still understood that the execution of Julius and Ethel Rosenberg would speak for the country. For supporters of clemency, the issue was not always the same as innocence. Some believed the Rosenbergs had been wrongly convicted. Others objected to the death sentence itself. Others focused especially on Ethel Rosenberg, whose precise role remains one of the most disputed parts of the case. Later records would sharpen that dispute. National Archives grand jury releases and reporting by the National Security Archive would undermine the central courtroom claim that Ethel typed atomic notes for transmission to the Soviets, and David Greenglass would later publicly admit that he had lied about some testimony connected to that alleged typing role. Those later developments were not available to the public in the same way in June of 1953, but the intensity around Ethel's sentence was already part of the clemency struggle. For opponents of clemency, the case stood for a different lesson. The Soviet atomic test of 1949 had ended the American atomic monopoly. The Korean War had deepened the sense that communist expansion was not abstract but immediate. Judge Kaufman had already tied the Rosenbergs' crime in his sentencing rationale to the broader Cold War atmosphere. Within that frame, mercy could appear to some as weakness, and punishment as a national statement. The death sentence was not only a penalty against two people. It had become, in the eyes of many, a message about atomic secrecy, loyalty, and the danger of espionage. President Eisenhower declined clemency in June of 1953. That decision did not simply close a file. It confirmed that the executive branch would not intervene where the courts had not. The petitions preserved among the Eisenhower Presidential Library, Rosenberg documents, remain important because they mark the last attempt to change the outcome through presidential action. They show the final stage of the case as a convergence of law, politics, public emotion, and state power. There is something revealing in the institutional geography of these final days. The case had begun in the world of investigation, with a chain that the FBI traced from Klaus Fuchs to Harry Gold to David Greenglass, and then to Julius and Ethel Rosenberg. It had moved through Manhattan Federal Court, where the prosecution built a conspiracy narrative around meetings, couriers, family testimony, and atomic-related information. It had passed through sentencing before Judge Kaufman. Then, in the final stretch, it occupied the Supreme Court and the White House. The Rosenberg case became a map of American authority. Investigators, prosecutors, judges, justices, and the president, each touching the same question from a different institutional angle. By June 19, 1953, the legal and political avenues had narrowed to an end. Julius and Ethel Rosenberg were executed by electric chair at Sing Sing Prison in Ossining, New York. The death sentence imposed more than 2 years earlier had become an event. The deadline had arrived. And yet, even that did not end the case. It ended the lives of Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, but it did not end the argument over what had been proven, what had been hidden, and what had been distorted by secrecy and fear. The trial jury had heard one version of the case, built from witnesses, exhibits, and Cold War prosecution. But some of the records that would later reshape historical understanding were not before that jury at all. The most important of those belonged to a secret intelligence effort that began during the war, remained classified for decades, and would not become public until long after the executions. Its name was VENONA. After the executions, the public argument remained trapped inside the evidence that had been visible in court. There were witnesses. There were exhibits. There was the Jell-O Box, the Greenglass sketch, the testimony about meetings, couriers, and typing. There were the words of prosecutors and defense lawyers, and the sentence pronounced by Judge Irving R. Kaufman. For years, that was the record most Americans could see. But it was not the whole record. Behind the trial, behind the appeals, and behind the clemency fight, there was another stream of information moving through the government. It did not appear in the U.S. District Court for the Southern District of New York. It was not explained to the jury in March of 1951. It was not available to the protesters, the editorial writers, the clergy, the White House petitioners, or the family members trying to understand whether justice had been done. That stream of information belonged to VENONA. VENONA was not a courtroom exhibit. It was a secret intelligence program. According to National Security Agency history, the program began in February of 1943 during the Second World War as an effort by the Army Signal Intelligence Service to examine Soviet diplomatic communications. At the time, the United States and the Soviet Union were wartime allies against Nazi Germany. But alliance did not mean trust. American intelligence officials were interested in what Soviet representatives were sending home, and the Army Signal Intelligence Service began the difficult work of studying encrypted Soviet traffic. The work was slow, technical, and hidden. It was the opposite of trial drama. There were no public witnesses, no judge instructing a jury, no newspaper sketches of defendants at counsel table. The materials involved messages, code systems, partial breaks, names, cover names, and fragments of communication that analysts tried to assemble into meaning. What mattered was not one dramatic confession, but the gradual accumulation of patterns. For the Rosenberg story, VENONA matters because it changed the historical balance after the trial was already over and the sentence had already been carried out. The jury that convicted Julius and Ethel Rosenberg heard the prosecution's public case. It heard from David Greenglass and Ruth Greenglass. It heard about Harry Gold. It heard about meetings, wartime contacts, and alleged atomic information. It saw the government build a conspiracy narrative from human testimony and physical exhibits. But the jury did not see the VENONA decrypts. Those materials were classified. They remained outside the adversarial process. Defense counsel could not test them in front of the jury. Prosecutors did not use them as public proof. Jurors could not weigh them against testimony. The judge could not instruct the jury on how to consider them. That absence is one of the central tensions in the Rosenberg case. Later evidence could strengthen part of the government's historical claim without having strengthened the legal case that was actually presented in court. When VENONA materials began to become public decades later, they did not arrive into a neutral world. They entered an argument that had been burning since the executions. To some, the Rosenbergs were victims of anti-communist hysteria and a government determined to make an example. To others, they were spies whose defenders had ignored the reality of Soviet espionage. The release of previously secret material did not erase those divisions, but it changed what historians had to confront. The first public release of translated VENONA messages occurred in July of 1995. By then, the Cold War had ended. The Soviet Union itself no longer existed. The political climate that had made the Rosenberg trial so explosive had shifted. Records that once would have been treated as untouchable national security material were now being opened for public study. And in those records, the Rosenberg case looked different than it had to many earlier observers. National Security Agency materials identified Julius Rosenberg with Soviet code names including Liberal and Antonne. That point is historically significant. It connects Julius not merely to the claims of courtroom witnesses, but to Soviet intelligence communications as later decrypted and released. For researchers, that changed the evidentiary landscape. Julius Rosenberg's espionage activity, long disputed in public debate, became much harder to dismiss as only the product of pressured testimony, Cold War politics, or prosecutorial overreach. But VENONA did not simply close the case. It complicated it. The decrypts were intelligence records, not trial transcripts. They were secret for decades. They were not part of the public proceedings that led to conviction and execution. And the strongest historical implications did not fall equally on Julius and Ethel. The later understanding that strongly supports Julius Rosenberg's espionage activity sits beside an enduring question about Ethel Rosenberg's precise role. That distinction matters because the trial and the sentence treated Julius and Ethel together in the most severe possible way. Both were convicted. Both were sentenced to death. Both were executed at Sing Sing prison on June 19, 1953. VENONA sharpened the picture of Soviet espionage in the United States, but it did not automatically validate every courtroom claim. This is where the Rosenberg case becomes less like a simple mystery and more like an archive problem. Different kinds of records answer different kinds of questions. Trial testimony tells us what jurors were allowed to hear. Intelligence decrypts tell us what secret agencies were trying to understand outside public view. Clemency files show how the case moved through political and moral pressure. Later grand jury materials reveal what witnesses said before the trial narrative hardened into its courtroom form. Each archive changes the angle of view. VENONA's effect was especially powerful because of timing. Had the decrypts been public in 1951, the case against Julius might have been understood very differently by the jury and by the country. But they were not public. They were hidden inside a classified intelligence system. The government prosecuted the Rosenbergs without presenting those materials. So when historians later used VENONA to reassess the case, they were not simply discovering evidence that had been overlooked in court. They were confronting evidence that the courtroom never had. That distinction has kept the controversy alive. A trial is supposed to decide guilt based on admissible evidence presented under rules, with cross-examination and defense challenge. Intelligence work has different purposes. It seeks information, not verdicts. It can operate through secrecy, partial knowledge, and sources that cannot be publicly exposed. In national security cases, those two systems often collide. The Rosenberg case became one of the most famous examples of that collision. The state may know, or believe it knows, more than it can reveal. The jury may decide based on less than the government possesses. The public may argue for decades without access to the material that shaped official certainty. VENONA also forces a careful separation between historical guilt and procedural justice. A person can be implicated by later records, and still the fairness of the original process can remain open to scrutiny. Julius Rosenberg's identification in NSA materials under code names such as Liberal and Antenna strengthened the historical case that he was involved in espionage, but the jury did not convict him on VENONA. It convicted him on the evidence presented in Manhattan under the pressure of the early Cold War, after testimony from people who had their own exposure, motives, and risks. For Ethel Rosenberg, that separation becomes even more important. The public trial story placed her inside the conspiracy in a way that helped justify the same punishment imposed on Julius. But the later historical record has not settled her role with the same clarity. The most dramatic courtroom claim against her, the allegation that she typed atomic notes for transmission to the Soviets, would be seriously undermined by later archival releases and by David Greenglass's own later admissions. VENONA did not remove that problem. If anything, it made precision more necessary. The release in July of 1995, therefore, did two things at once. It undercut the view that the Rosenberg case was entirely fabricated, and it intensified the need to distinguish between Julius Rosenberg's espionage activity and Ethel Rosenberg's contested role. It pushed the story away from slogans. Not all defense claims survived the archives. Not all prosecution claims did either. That is why VENONA belongs at the center of any serious re-examination, but not at the end of it. It changed historical understanding, especially around Julius. It showed that the government's fear of Soviet espionage was not imaginary. It placed the Rosenberg network inside a larger pattern of secret wartime and post-war intelligence activity. But it also reminded us that secrecy can distort justice, even when some secret information later proves important. For decades, Americans had argued over a trial record that was incomplete. Then VENONA opened one sealed chamber. After that, another would begin to open as well. This time, the records would not be coded Soviet messages translated by intelligence analysts. They would be American legal records, taken under oath before trial, hidden for years, and eventually released through the National Archives. In those pages, the old wound would reopen around Ethel Rosenberg, Ruth Greenglass, Harry Gold, and the testimony that helped send a New York couple to the electric chair. VENONA had changed the argument by revealing a hidden intelligence record. But the next opening came from a different kind of secrecy. Not coded Soviet cables, not signals intelligence, not a wartime cryptanalytic program held inside the national security state. This time, the material came from the American legal system itself. Grand jury testimony is usually sealed for a reason. It is taken before trial, outside public view, often while prosecutors are still building a case. Witnesses appear under oath. They answer questions without the full theater of a courtroom trial, without a jury weighing guilt or innocence in the open. For decades, the Rosenberg grand jury records remained closed, part of the buried architecture beneath one of the most argued over trials in American history. Then, beginning in 2008, the National Archives released formerly secret Rosenberg grand jury transcripts. The release included testimony from Ethel Rosenberg, Ruth Greenglass, Harry Gold, and others. It was not the first time the case had been revisited. By then, VENONA had already reshaped the debate around Julius Rosenberg and Soviet espionage. But these new records reopened something more intimate and more painful: the question of how Ethel Rosenberg had been placed inside the government's courtroom story. At trial, one of the central claims against Ethel was dramatic and specific. David Greenglass and Ruth Greenglass gave testimony that helped portray Ethel not merely as Julius Rosenberg's wife, not merely as someone who knew people in communist circles, but as an active participant in preparing atomic information for transmission. The most memorable allegation was that Ethel typed notes connected to atomic material. In the courtroom narrative, this mattered enormously. Typing was not an abstract association. It was an act. It made Ethel useful to the conspiracy. It gave the jury a concrete image: a woman at a typewriter, converting handwritten notes into a form that could move through a spy network. That image followed her for decades. The National Security Archive, reviewing the released grand jury material, reported that the grand jury testimony contradicted the central courtroom claim that Ethel Rosenberg typed atomic notes for transmission to the Soviets. The significance of that contradiction was not technical. It went to the heart of how a defendant was made visible to a jury. In a conspiracy case, prosecutors did not need to show that each defendant personally handed over a finished weapon design. They needed to build a network. They needed links, shared intent, meetings, couriers, recognition devices, and acts that could be read as participation. For Julius Rosenberg, later evidence, including VENONA, would strongly support involvement in Soviet espionage. But for Ethel, the question had always been narrower and more contested. What did she do? What did she know? And what was proven in open court? The grand jury transcripts did not erase the trial. They did not undo the conviction. They did not reverse the execution. But they forced historians and the public to look again at the distance between pretrial testimony and courtroom testimony. That distance matters because grand jury testimony had been taken closer to the investigation's early stages. It captured witnesses before the trial narrative hardened into its final public form. When formerly sealed testimony later appears to conflict with what a jury heard, the archive becomes more than a storage place. It becomes a second courtroom, one that convenes too late to save anyone, but not too late to change what history can responsibly say. Ruth Greenglass's role is especially important here. She was not a peripheral name in the Rosenberg story. She was David Greenglass's wife, tied to the family channel through which the government connected Los Alamos to Julius and Ethel Rosenberg. In the trial account, the Greenglasses helped provide the human bridge between the secret world of the Manhattan Project and the apartment-level world of meetings, notes, and family trust. The prosecution's larger structure had depended on a chain. Klaus Fuchs had been arrested in Britain and convicted under the British Official Secrets Act. His case had led investigators toward Harry Gold, the courier whose identification of David Greenglass helped lead the investigation to Greenglass. David Greenglass had worked as a machinist at Los Alamos during the Manhattan Project. At trial, he testified that he gave Julius Rosenberg a sketch and descriptive material related to an atomic bomb. Government Exhibit 8, identified by the FBI as Greenglass's trial sketch of a cross-section of an atom bomb, became one of the case's visual anchors. But Ethel's position in that chain was more fragile. The government needed to show that she was not simply present near the conspiracy, not simply married to Julius, not simply related to David. The typing claim helped do that. It supplied action. It gave the jury a moment that could be understood without needing to decode intelligence cables or understand implosion-type bomb design. Someone had notes. Someone typed them. Someone helped move secrets. When the National Security Archive reported that the released grand jury testimony contradicted that central courtroom claim, it reopened a question that had never really gone away. Was Ethel Rosenberg convicted and executed on evidence that overstated her role? Was the courtroom version shaped not only by memory and pressure, but by the government's need to make her appear indispensable to the conspiracy? The wound deepened because David Greenglass later publicly admitted that he had lied about some testimony connected to Ethel's alleged typing role. That admission did not make the entire case vanish. It did not turn Julius Rosenberg into a bystander. It did not erase the reality of Soviet atomic espionage or the fact that American investigators were tracking a real security breach. But it did make the most devastating testimony against Ethel look less stable. And in a death case, instability has a different moral weight. A prison sentence can sometimes be revisited. A conviction can sometimes be reconsidered. A reputation can sometimes be revised. But Julius and Ethel Rosenberg were executed at Sing Sing Prison in Ossining, New York, on June 19, 1953. By the time the grand jury records began to emerge from the National Archives in 2008, more than half a century had passed. The legal system could no longer change their fate. The only thing left to correct was the public record. That is why archives matter in this story. They do not speak with the urgency of a breaking news bulletin. They wait. They sit in boxes, in institutional custody, under seals and restrictions, until a later generation is permitted to read what an earlier generation could not. When the Rosenberg grand jury transcripts became available, they did not arrive as a confession or a single decisive answer. They arrived as layered testimony, fragments of legal memory, statements taken under oath before the trial became a national symbol. The release also showed something uncomfortable about historical certainty. For years, the Rosenberg case had often been argued in absolutes. To some, the Rosenbergs were guilty spies whose punishment reflected the danger of Soviet infiltration. To others, they were victims of Cold War hysteria, condemned in a poisoned political atmosphere. The later record made both simple versions harder to sustain. VENONA strengthened the case that Julius Rosenberg was involved in espionage. The grand jury releases weakened confidence in the most dramatic courtroom claim against Ethel. The result was not clarity in the usual sense. It was a more demanding kind of clarity, the recognition that different parts of the case rest on different evidentiary ground. Harry Gold's grand jury testimony belonged to the same released world of pretrial records. Gold had been part of the investigative route that connected Fuchs to Greenglass and therefore helped bring the government's attention toward the Rosenbergs. His place in the archive reminds us that the case was assembled through a sequence of witnesses, identifications, and admissions. It did not appear whole. It was built piece by piece by investigators and prosecutors working inside the fear of the early Cold War. That fear was not imaginary. The Soviet Union had detonated its first atomic bomb in 1949. The Department of Energy's Manhattan Project history says Soviet espionage probably hastened the Soviet atomic bomb by approximately 12 to 18 months. The United States had lost its short-lived atomic monopoly, and officials believed that secrets from Los Alamos had helped accelerate that loss. In that climate, prosecutors did not present the Rosenberg case as ordinary espionage. They presented it as a national wound. But the grand jury records show that another wound remained beneath it, the possibility that a courtroom narrative, once sharpened for conviction, could become more certain than the evidence underneath it. This is not only a Rosenberg problem, it is an archive problem, a secrecy problem, and a justice problem. When records remain sealed, public understanding freezes around what was available at the time. Journalists, citizens, judges, and historians argue over the visible record. Then, decades later, hidden documents appear and disturb the settled story. They may confirm some suspicions and destroy others. They may strengthen one part of the government's case while weakening another. They may arrive too late to matter legally, but not too late to matter historically. In the Rosenberg case, the National Archives release beginning in 2008 did exactly that. It did not close the debate. It made the debate more precise. It asked the country to separate Julius from Ethel, where the evidence required separation. It asked whether the government's successful prosecution had depended on testimony that later records would undermine. It asked what a jury might have thought if the grand jury record, or the contradictions inside it, had been available in the same public way. And it asked one question that is almost impossible to answer cleanly. How should history judge an irreversible punishment when the archive later shows that the story told in court was not the whole story? By the time those pages opened, the electric chair, the appeals, the clemency petitions, and the public protests were long past. Judge Irving R. Kaufman's sentence had become historical fact. Sing Sing had become the fixed endpoint. But the case itself was not finished because the record was not finished. The Rosenberg files kept teaching the same lesson in different forms. VENONA showed that hidden evidence could confirm the reality of espionage. The grand jury transcripts showed that hidden evidence could also complicate the justice of a prosecution. One archive hardened the case against Julius D.X. Another reopened doubt around Ethel. That is the place where the Rosenberg story still stands, not between guilt and innocence as slogans, but between proof and punishment, secrecy and trial, national fear and individual fate. The record now contains evidence of espionage and evidence of distortion. It contains a real spy network and a contested death sentence. It contains the Cold War state trying to protect secrets, and the same state asking a jury to trust testimony that later releases would place under a harsher light. The wound reopened because the archive did what archives sometimes do. It refused to let the verdict have the last word. And so the archive leaves us in a harder place than either side of the old public argument wanted to admit. It does not return the Rosenberg case to a simple story of innocence crushed by hysteria. It also does not leave the original prosecution untouched, as if every courtroom claim had aged into certainty. The later record does something more difficult. It separates questions that were once fused together by fear, secrecy, and punishment. One question is whether Soviet espionage reached into American wartime secrets. The answer, from the record now available, is yes. The investigative chain that moved from Klaus Fuchs to Harry Gold to David Greenglass did not invent the existence of atomic espionage. Los Alamos was not only a scientific fortress in New Mexico, it was also a place where human loyalties, ideology, family connections, and courier routes could pierce the walls of secrecy. The Department of Energy's Manhattan Project history has said that Soviet espionage probably hastened the Soviet atomic bomb by approximately 12 to 18 months. That estimate matters because it explains why the United States government saw these cases as something larger than ordinary spying. Atomic information was not just another category of military intelligence. It belonged to the balance of power in the early Cold War. Another question is whether Julius Rosenberg was part of that espionage world. The later evidence strongly supports that he was. The public release of VENONA materials in July of 1995 gave historians access to translated Soviet communications that had never been shown to the trial jury. National Security Agency materials identified Julius Rosenberg with Soviet code names including Liberal and Antonay. Those materials did not erase every uncertainty about the original prosecution. They did not make the trial more transparent in retrospect, but they did reshape the historical argument. Julius Rosenberg was not only a symbol onto whom Cold War America projected its fears. The record now supports the conclusion that he engaged in espionage activity on behalf of the Soviet Union. That conclusion is important because the Rosenberg case was, for decades, argued in extremes. To some, the Rosenbergs were martyrs, victims of anti-communist panic and judicial overreach. To others, they were traitors whose punishment proved that the country could defend itself against internal enemies. The later evidence does not fit neatly inside either position. It shows that domestic communist espionage was real. It also shows that the government's public case was not identical to the government's hidden knowledge. That difference is not a technicality. In a death penalty case, it becomes part of the moral record. Then there is Ethel Rosenberg. Her place in the case remains the deepest fracture. She was not tried alone. She was tried beside Julius Rosenberg and Morton Sobell in the U.S. District Court for the Southern District of New York before Judge Irving R. Kaufman. She was convicted of conspiracy to commit espionage, the same charge as her husband. She was sentenced to death on April 5, 1951. She was executed at Sing Sing Prison in Ossining, New York, on June 19, 1953. But the precise nature of what she did, what she knew, and what the government could prove against her has remained contested. The most dramatic trial claim against her was that she typed atomic notes for transmission to the Soviets. That image carried enormous weight. It turned a wife and mother into an active participant at the center of the alleged conspiracy. It gave the jury a clear act to imagine. It gave prosecutors a courtroom moment that made Ethel visible inside the machinery of espionage. Later records weakened that image. The National Archives began releasing formerly secret Rosenberg grand jury transcripts in 2008, including testimony from Ethel Rosenberg, Ruth Greenglass, Harry Gold, and others. The National Security Archive reported that the released grand jury testimony contradicted the central courtroom claim that Ethel typed atomic notes. David Greenglass later publicly admitted that he had lied about some testimony connected to Ethel's alleged typing role. That does not automatically answer every question about Ethel. It does not prove that she knew nothing. It does not reduce the case to a single false sentence. But it does mean that one of the most powerful claims used to establish her active role was later placed under serious doubt. And when the punishment was irreversible, that doubt cannot be treated as an academic footnote. This is what the Rosenberg case still proves and still cannot prove. It proves that the early Cold War fear of espionage was not imaginary. Soviet intelligence did seek American defense and atomic-related information. There were couriers, contacts, and insiders. There were people willing to pass secrets. There were failures of security inside systems designed to be sealed. The Fuchs case in Britain, Harry Gold's courier role, David Greenglass's work at Los Alamos, and the later VENONA materials all belong to that reality. It proves that secrecy can protect a state, but also distort public justice. VENONA was hidden for reasons tied to intelligence protection. Grand jury records were sealed for reasons tied to legal process. But when evidence remains hidden for decades, the public verdict is forced to live without part of the record. In this case, hidden material later strengthened a case that espionage existed and that Julius was involved. Hidden material also weakened confidence in the most vivid accusation against Ethel. The same broad category, secrecy, points in both directions. It proves that courtroom narratives can become national memory. The Jell-O Box recognition device, preserved in National Archives records as a trial exhibit from March 6 to March 29, 1951, became more than a piece of cardboard. Government Exhibit 8, identified by the FBI as David Greenglass's trial sketch of a cross-section of an atom bomb, became more than a drawing. These objects made the invisible world of espionage feel solid. They helped translate coded messages, secret meetings, and ideological commitments into things a jury could see. But objects do not explain themselves. They acquire meaning from testimony, from prosecutorial framing, from the fear of the moment. It proves that family testimony can carry unbearable force. David Greenglass was not a stranger to Ethel Rosenberg. He was her brother. Ruth Greenglass was not an outside observer to the family drama. Their words helped define Ethel's fate. The government's case used intimacy as evidence: the apartment, the conversations, the typing, the family link between Los Alamos and New York. That is part of why the case still wounds. It was not only a spy case. It was a family case under the pressure of a national security prosecution. It proves that punishment can outlive proof. Julius and Ethel Rosenberg were executed before the public knew what VENONA contained. They were executed before the grand jury transcripts were released. They were executed before David Greenglass's later admission about parts of his testimony connected to Ethel's alleged typing role. The law reached its final act long before the archive did. And this case still cannot prove something equally important. It cannot prove that the trial, as the public saw it, contained all the truth necessary to justify everything that followed. It cannot prove that Ethel Rosenberg's death sentence rested on evidence as strong as the punishment was severe. It cannot prove that the state's need to protect atomic secrets removed its obligation to make the courtroom record reliable. It cannot prove that fear, even justified fear, is harmless when it enters sentencing. Judge Irving R. Kaufman's sentence linked the Rosenbergs' crime to the broader Cold War atmosphere, including the Korean War. That connection tells us how the case felt in its own time. The Soviet Union had tested an atomic bomb in 1949. The United States had lost its short-lived atomic monopoly. The Korean War was underway. Communism was not an abstraction in American public life. It appeared as an international rival, a military enemy, and a domestic suspicion. In that atmosphere, conspiracy to commit espionage became more than a legal charge. It became a national drama about loyalty, survival, and betrayal. But history has to do something different from the courtroom and something different from the crowd outside it. It has to hold more than one truth at a time. The Rosenberg case matters because it fused nearly every pressure point of secret America: domestic subversion fears, nuclear secrecy, family testimony, courtroom performance, classified intelligence, sealed legal records, presidential clemency, Supreme Court litigation, and irreversible punishment. It moved from Los Alamos to Manhattan, from the U.S. District Court for the Southern District of New York to the White House, from the Supreme Court to Sing Sing Prison. It passed through agencies and archives, through FBI accounts, NSA history, National Archives releases, and Eisenhower Presidential Library documents. It became both a legal case and a historical argument. And it remains divided because the record itself is divided. There is evidence of espionage. There is evidence of injustice. There is a stronger case against Julius than many defenders once allowed. There is a more troubling case against Ethel than many prosecutors and supporters of the verdict wanted to face. There is the reality of Soviet spying, and there is the reality that a death sentence can make later doubt impossible to repair. That may be the final lesson of the Rosenberg case. Not that America's fears were all false. Not that the government was always right. Not that the Rosenbergs were only villains or only martyrs. The lesson is that a democracy under pressure can discover a real threat and still mishandle the pursuit of justice. It can uncover espionage and still build parts of its public case on testimony that later records undermine. It can protect secrets and still leave citizens wondering whether secrecy has hidden not only intelligence but error. The executions at Sing Sing ended 2 lives on June 19, 1953. They did not end the case. The case survived because the documents kept speaking. VENONA spoke. The grand jury transcripts spoke. The clemency papers, the trial exhibits, the court records, and the later admissions all kept adding weight to a story that the verdict had tried to close. What remains is not a clean ending. It is a question that has outlived the trial, the sentence, the executions, and the first generation of argument around them. How should history judge a case when the evidence of espionage and the evidence of injustice both remain part of the record?